Hey everyone, it's us. We are back with another episode of part 4 of 5. Fuck! Bones, cut that out.
No, you were right the first time.
Was I?
You were right the
God
first time.
damn dyslexia!
Yeah. We're doing great.
Hey everyone, we're back with another episode of part 5 of 4. The podcast where if you have an unpopular opinion about BL, don't worry, we probably do too. Saying all the things you do or don't want to hear. We're here to engage with BL media from Japan, Thailand, China, Korea, and honestly, who knows what else kind of tickles our fancy. We're talking about filmmaking techniques, narrative analysis, sometimes fandom woes, sometimes we get a little discoursey, but we always make sure to laugh while asking the questions like, hey, why don't bottoms move their arms? Or, something of the like. We may not be experts, but we are loud, chaotic, and full of opinions. Do you want to tell everybody what we're talking about today?
So, today we are talking about Dead Friends Forever, the sophomore outing for Beyond Cloud, who also produced Kin Porsche. So the show just recently wrapped up, and you and I both got really into it. So this week we're just kind of talking about this show and what we thought of it.
Yeah, to preface this, folks, one day I will get the intro completely right.
We also didn't introduce ourselves, I realized.
I feel like we don't introduce ourselves that often, and I'm kind of fine with that.
We are mysterious and unknowable.
But yeah, so we're talking about Dead Friend Forever today. Specifically, we're going to go through, what kind of horror was Dead Friend Forever, kind of our general thoughts. We're going to go talk about some fandom theories, probably going to have some pretty unpopular opinions about the show. We did like it. I will just kind of start that off. We did both like it.
Yes.
Personally, I am a huge horror fan. My co-host.
I am also a huge horror fan. I don't think I'm as huge of a horror fan as you are, but I love horror very, very much.
I am a gross person who does love watching slashers. And if I could, I would get like a Jason Voorhees tattoo, but I don't know where, and that would cost money. So I also don't want people to think that I'm like,
you have one in spirit.
Gonna hurt them or something. I don't know.
Fair.
So I guess to start, why don't you give like your general thoughts about the show? Like, how did you hear of it?
Okay.
Like, what did you think of it? Et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. So I heard about Dead Friends Forever through Kin Porsche because same production company. A couple of members of the cast are also, 4 members of the cast were also in Kin Porsche in various smaller roles. So when they released the trailer for it, I got really excited because I liked the actors that they had cast in Dead Friends Forever. I liked that they were not being kind of put into branded pairings, that they were getting mixed up a little bit, and I really like horror overall. So I was really excited about it from the get-go. And then I watched like the pilot when it came out, and then I got really busy for a few weeks, and I had like 4 or 5 episodes to catch up on. So I marathoned those, and then I was like, oh no, this is like very fun. This is very interesting. I really like what they're doing here. And then I started keeping up with it weekly, waiting with bated breath for the next episode to drop. So yeah, like overall, I really liked this show. It kind of, I think, does the same thing that Kin Porsche did, where it feels less like a BL that's about horror, like something maybe more like Ghost House. And it feels more like a horror show that is also a BL. And I think that's kind of the style Beyond Cloud is developing, and I'm really into it.
I am also really into this style that you're talking about that BOC is doing, and I really appreciate it because it's more in line with like what I personally like, my personal taste. I remember them releasing like, I think it was like the teaser trailer maybe or whatever, with the character that we now know as Jin holding the video camera through the running of the halls. It was a very sleek and interesting trailer, like teaser trailer, and I had thought about watching it, but it came out in like December. And December is always a crazy month for me for personal reasons. So I was not able to watch it initially. And I'm also, and you know this, very bad at watching shows. I am very lazy. I am more of a movie person.
Very true.
But I finally sat down one day, and I think 10 episodes were out, and I accidentally binged all 10 episodes in like a night. Like, completely accidentally. That was not on purpose. It was not planned. And my body was very upset with me the next morning. But It was worth it. So I only actually interacted with fandom for like maybe 3-ish weeks, 2-ish weeks or so.
They were 3 of the most intense weeks of the
They
fandom,
felt
to be
like it.
fair.
I'm not gonna lie, they really felt like it.
Okay, so maybe at this point we should, for anybody who hasn't watched Dead Friends Forever, tell you a little bit about what it's about. So spoilers for the next couple minutes. So Dead Friends Forever is about a group of friends who are getting ready to graduate high school, who decide to go hang out in one of the friends' like McMansion cabin in the middle of these woods, where rumors are that there are worshippers of a deity called Janta who sacrifice human beings, and they're gonna go to this cabin and they're gonna drink and do drugs and have sex, and we all know what happens to people who do that in horror movies. So kind of as we go along, we find out that several of the people in this group share a terrible secret about some very shitty things they did to another person a couple years back. It is slowly revealed that this whole outing has been orchestrated from behind the scenes to seek revenge, question mark, justice,
Retribution.
question mark, answers, question mark. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's kind of like the gist. That's like the series description. I would say is pretty accurate, and I would say like it has the hallmarks in initially, especially in the beginning, or at least the flavor, I would say, of what people would consider a slasher. Like if you don't watch a lot of horror, I think that this show is actually a really good, what I would call like baby's first horror. And that's not meant to be condescending or anything. One of the things I noticed in fandom, and we'll talk more about fandom and its reaction to the show a little later, but one of the things I noticed was that fandom was talking about how gory the show was and how violent.
And it's not. It's really not.
Like, there are some potentially triggering things, especially I would argue in the last episode, that occur as far as the violence goes. But
Yes.
in general, as like an overall overview of horror, it's a really good baby's first horror because it's actually not that violent. It's really not that scary. I think there were only a couple moments where, and this was probably because I was watching at 3 a.m. At night, that spooked me. I think there was like 2 that spooked me a little bit. I do love the mask that is in the show.
The mask design is so good. It's so unsettling. I think it's hard with as much horror has been made today to make a mask that's like truly unsettling in a way that I haven't seen before. But that mask, like it's so good. It's so good. And I'm glad that they hit that note because a lot of the show really hinges on that mask, like instantly filling you with dread. So I feel like it could have been genuinely a much worse show if the killer's mask had not been as strong as it is.
In comparison to other slashers that are much more violent and not nearly as compelling, like My Bloody Valentine. Both the original from, I believe, the 70s, I'd have to double check that, but the original and then the remake that had Jensen Ackles, for all you Supernatural fans.
Ackles in it.
Yep. I've watched both.
Yep.
Neither are that scary. The original is scarier. But the remake is just violent. And you're kind of like, oh, Jensen, we were slumming it, weren't we, baby?
Well, because Jared Padalecki was also in the remake of House of Wax. It was like a thing for a minute where Supernatural cast was going off to do
Jared Padalecki was in the remake of House of Wax, which I actually do like. But he plays like a... Yeah, he plays like a secondary character, and Chad Michael Murray, a different CW star, plays one of the leads.
I always forget. Yeah, a different.
Yes, Paris Hilton
is
it is a conglomeration of just early 2000 faces. And Jared Padalecki was also in the remake sequel, the requel of Friday the 13th.
Oh, you're right. Yes, he was. Anyways, Supernatural tangent.
Somehow, Supernatural always weaves its way into the conversation. I didn't even finish that damn show. But it's just so part of the cultural zeitgeist. But yeah, I think Dead Friend Forever, if you don't like horror, if you're not used to watching horror, I think it's a good segue into more horror because it's not super scary. It's honestly not super violent.
There's such a restrained amount of blood that the special effects team had to have on hand for a horror show. This was not like a many thousands of gallons of blood movie. This was like a very reasonable amount of fake blood.
You could tell that like within the budget they knew when and where to employ like their special effects for like the more violent scenes that you do see. Yes. And I do think that's effective. Like I think the violence and stuff
Yeah, I
in the
do
show
too.
is effective. I just don't think it's very scary.
I don't think it is either. So I would place it kind of in the same realm as like the Fear Street
I was
movies that
thinking the
Netflix
same
did,
thing.
where it's like for people in the US like that kind of goosebumps sort of cast to it, where it's not like scary. It's not like for me personally, it's not like The Ring where I can feel my chest seize up when I think about The Ring. It's more kind of in that jump scare, spooky, like solving a mystery, running around.
It's got like an excitement element to it.
Yeah, yeah. It's not like super dread heavy, I would say.
You're not going to feel the way you feel if you watch Hereditary or Midsommar or Men or really almost
Exactly.
any A24 horror film. The Fear Street films are a great comparison, especially because they are also very gay, and I love them dearly for it.
They are very gay.
They are more
Yes.
viscerally violent, just because, not even violent so much as gory.
Yeah, that bread slicing moment in the first one is a lot.
She didn't deserve all that. So yeah, it's more gory.
Yeah.
The second one is my personal favorite.
It's also my favorite.
Oh, it pays such great homage to like Friday, which is one of my favorite slashes of all time, and like a bunch of other stuff. Oh, it's just fun. I love horror movies set in the 80s. Totally Killer is a horror comedy. Totally recommend that as well.
So yeah, but I think calling it like a baby's first horror kind of thing is very fair. Like it's definitely like a step above like Goosebumps or Are You Afraid of the Dark or something that kind of was on kids TV channels. It's a step up from that. It's not like getting into like the Saw levels in terms of gore. It's very far away from like any mainstream psychological horror movie. It's not quite at that level either. So it's kind of like a good like training wheels kind of horror. And I think that was really interesting because it seemed to me like for, I would say, a majority of the fandom, that's kind of where they were at with horror, where I saw so many people talking about that they don't like horror, they didn't watch horror, but they were watching this. So that was one of the things I found so interesting about this show, kind of aside from the show itself, was as someone who has watched a lot of horror, seeing a lot of people who haven't watched a lot of horror talk about a horror show and like how they interpreted what genre it was, how they like what theories they were kind of coming up with, like what they anticipated was going to happen. It was really interesting to me kind of seeing people who didn't have that same core of knowledge react to the show in real time.
I agree, and I'm going to be very annoying about this, as I was in my 2 weeks of participation in fandom. Because one of the things, and I'll ask this for your opinion as well, but like one of the things that I had seen in fandom a lot, and I think what created a lot of specific types of expectations in fandom was that Dead Friend Forever was a slasher. Personally, I don't think it's a slasher at all. Like, I think it has the aesthetics of a slasher, like the surface level aesthetics of a slasher, but it does not have like the soul of a slasher.
Yeah, I would agree. So, one of the things I actually liked about the show is that I felt like it played with that intentional kind of shifting of horror subgenres in a way I really like. Because the pilot, or the episode 1, is very much a slasher setup. You have people who are about to go do something big in their life. They're going to an isolated location. There's some kind of external threat happening in like the wilderness around them. Like there's an ominous cast to where they're going, and they're drinking and they're doing drugs, and like multiple characters are having sex. So a lot of that setup is so extremely slasher movie. But as it goes along, it starts to drop that slasherness, and you realize that this isn't a story that's a kind of about random murder, which is what slashers tend to be. Slashers are a lot about like the unknowable danger or being attacked where in places you should be safe for no reason, for something you haven't done. And as they kind of dropped that, and we started to realize, like, oh no, like these people have done something. They've done something bad. Oh, they've done something really bad. Oh, 2 of these people are not who we think they are. It sort of began to shift from a slasher to something much more revenge-based, something more psychological, more about guilt and what you owe people and the choices you make. And I really liked that. The thing that's got me about fandom calling it a slasher too is it wasn't just calling it a slasher. A lot of people were specifically comparing it to Scream, which of all the slashers, I think it is the least like
That was
Scream.
very frustrating for me.
Well, yeah, because in part, Scream is such a specific horror movie, right? It's horror satire that really worked. That's why they've made so many of them. It worked so well on that kind of meta level that had staying power. But like, this is not a satire, right? Like, this isn't like Scream or like Cabin in the Woods or something that's like deliberately trying to reference specific other movies. It's just a show that has a show that has influences, but it's not like trying to poke fun.
Yeah, like, and this is where people's understandable gaps in knowledge, because again, I'm an annoying horror fan. And honestly, like, I'm not even a super fan. I have friends that will watch horror stuff that I'm like, I will die. Like, I will get an anxiety attack and die like a scared chihuahua. So like, I will just like freeze up and fall over. Like, they get into deep stuff. But for me, slashers are one of my favorite horror subgenres because they're fun. And I know that's kind of like a weird thing to say. And that was kind of one of the misconceptions I had seen in fandom of what a slasher is. And I saw people saying that slashers are like typically like revenge motivated or retributionally motivated. And that's simply just not true. And Scream especially was such an out-of-pocket thing. Like, I was tagged in something where somebody had compared it to Scream, and I was like, I can't answer this because I haven't watched the show. And then I watched the show, and I was like, oh, baby, no. Like, Chippy, no, this is not. Scream is, very, like you said, satirical horror. Like, now it's become more meta horror now because they're not really satirizing what is popular in horror in mainstream.
But like, the first two were very satire and very
smart.
I
do love 4 because the ending is so out of pocket and Emma Roberts just gives it her all. Like, she was so believable. Like, so I've seen all the Scream movies, and you know, yeah, the first one is definitely my favorite, like the best, I think, quality wise and conceptually. And if you watch Wes Craven's work, he plays around with horror satire again in Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which is a part of the Nightmare on Elm Street series, and it takes place within, like, quote-unquote, the real world. And it's a really, really interesting take of, like, horror satire and horror meta that, you know, I think is really interesting. But it is also, like, these are very specific subgenres, and it's like, Dead Friend Forever is not satirizing anything. It's not making fun of anything. It's not really, like, poking fun at horror tropes. And even if it was, I feel like it would end up poking fun at, like, Thai horror tropes or, like more Asian-esque horror tropes than anything Western that we would probably recognize.
And I think, too, with, like, the slasher comparison, I saw a lot of people being like, well, the kind of famous slashers, like, in the West at least, like Freddy and Jason and Michael Myers, they're like, well, they're getting revenge. And I'm like, but only superficially. Going back to the thing you said about fun, in, like, slasher movies, technically the reason someone is killing might be revenge. Like, you could argue Freddy is killing for revenge reasons, but it's a very superficial reason. In Freddy, he's not killing the people who killed him, he's killing their kids. Versus Dead Friends Forever, where the people are being targeted for extremely specific and real reasons. Like, in slashers, you very rarely remember much about the victims. You're almost always just thinking about the, like, slasher. That's why, like, you know Freddy's name, and most people could not at all name one of the youths that were killed in Friday the 13th. One of the youths. Like, you're more likely to remember how they died, right? Like, people remember, is it Johnny Depp? Johnny Depp getting sucked into the bed and, like, the blood fountain. They remember the girl getting, like, dragged around the room by an invisible hand. Versus something like Dead Friends Forever, where you know all of these characters intimately. You learn very much about their motivations and their mistakes and how they feel and why they did what they did. And that is such a tonal difference, I think, that kind of separates Dead Friends Forever, for me, pretty far out from the slasher genre generally.
And it's also interesting because, like, Jason actually doesn't want revenge, because Jason isn't the original killer in Friday. Like, which is something a lot of people don't know, you know, which is understandable because Jason has so many movies. And the original Friday, it's his mother who is killing the campers, which makes no sense. Like legitimately, like, if you watch the film and then you get to, like, the ending of the plot twist and stuff, and there she just shows up out of nowhere, like, at the end of Act 2, and she's just there. You don't know who this lady is, and she's like, you know, I'm just a sweet old lady.
Right. And they, like, don't address how she is, like, the height and build that she is, but also running around in
killing Kevin
the
Bacon.
woods, being as tall and stacked as Michael Myers was supposed to be. Like, just a very elaborate
they
stilt setup.
never explain it, and then she's like, psych, I'm actually the murderer, in her grandma sweater. Her and Corn would get along great. They both love the same sweaters. And then, you know, she dies. She gets taken out by the final girl, who I think is named Alice. I can't remember for sure, though. And then Alice doesn't necessarily find catharsis in the end. And we'll kind of get to this later, too, because we're going to talk about the ending of Dead Friend Forever. But yeah, so it's Mama Voorhees who's actually the original OG killer, which was also something that they asked in Scream 4 as one of the little, have you seen a scary movie questions? And I was like, I would have lived, because I know that.
Because isn't it a question in the first one? One of the things he asked Drew Barrymore, the one she gets wrong, is that it wasn't Jason, it was his mother. I think that's the question that, like, quote unquote, gets her killed, is getting that question wrong.
Which is, again, something that makes a lot of sense, because, like, she gets one movie, Jason gets all the other ones, including the one where Jason goes to space, and it's one of my favorite ones of the series. He's in space because he was cryogenically frozen like Walt Disney. How? Doesn't matter.
It's not
Fights
important.
a dominatrix robot lady. That's what's important. So as you can see, the slasher genre is large and varied. And it typically, doesn't have much to do with, like revenge might be, like, a cursory, a little motivation for your slasher. But, like, Mike Myers didn't care about revenge. And Leatherface doesn't care about revenge, like, for, like, the OGs and such. Freddy is kind of like an outlier in that regard. And he also wanted revenge for being murdered, but he was also, like, a child predator.
Yeah, he was also a child predator. Like, that's very important to
exactly
why they killed him. Was the
he got away with
thing.
It, essentially. Like, the law didn't do anything. Which also connects, and one of the things, for me, why Dead Friend Forever isn't much of a slasher is because, like, slashers originally, when they were reaching kind of like their peak in the 80s, technically Texas Chainsaw is from, I think, the late 70s, but, you know, I'm not an anthropologist. It is what it is. Es lo que es. But, like, one of the reasons they got so popular was this kind of intersection of a rise of conservative politics, a rise of quote-unquote serial killer mania, and, like, being reported in the news, missing children, and a rise of, like, specifically white American anxiety, where white people had moved from the cities into suburbs, and then suddenly, like, the suburbs, their, you know, quote-unquote white havens of safety and security, were no longer safe either. If you watch Black Phone with Ethan Hawke, it kind of touches upon this. I struggle with that movie a little bit just because all the young kids of color die, and that's just hard for me to watch. They don't die graphically, but still. But Black Phone kind of touches on that specific type of anxiety, and specifically, like, the political climate of the 80s in an interesting way.
And I think that's such a feature of horror generally. Like, horror, whether it's TV shows or movies or books or whatever, always, to some extent, represent the anxieties of the time in which they're made. This goes back to, like, Dracula and Frankenstein all the way up through to today, because horror is, for many people, how you get the catharsis. That's how you experience the anxieties that are part of your real world in a way that is kind of self-contained. So, like, that's such a key element of horror overall. I think that's important to keep in mind whenever you're talking about horror, is that horror is responding to society, specifically what society is anxious about.
I totally agree. And I feel like that's why horror, as far as, like, all kind of fictional genres go, is one of the most global. Horror is popular pretty globally.
Everywhere.
Like, I've watched horror from Korea and Japan, Thailand, different Latin American countries. European horror, like from Britain and France, will be... I haven't watched a ton of European horror, so no offense, Europe. Then again. Maybe a little offense to Britain. And also offense to Spain, because I'm Latin. But... all offense to Spain. But, like, you can see different anxieties in the horror that will be produced by a specific country. Like, I think the vampire horror film Let Me In, I don't remember what European country it's from. I'll make sure to put it in the description, though.
Sweden?
I think so.
Because I think it's originally Let the Right One In.
That's it. Yes, thank you. Yeah, and they made an American version of it.
The American one is not good.
And I do like kind of comparing those because like American versions of international horror films and such, because you can see why something worked in the original and why it didn't quite work in the American version. Like there was a whole era after The Ring and The Grudge did really well in America where they were just remaking a bunch of Japanese and Korean horror films and they don't really work.
Yeah.
And it's because expectations are different for both sets of audiences and like what you're trying to say. Like Dark Water for me is a very Japanese based story of horror and anxiety. Like that didn't really translate. It didn't help that Demi Moore can't act, but it didn't really translate into the American version.
Right. And I think if you're looking at it, this is turning into such an episode of horror overall. I think, like, The Ring specifically, I think is such a good example of, I would say, like, a remake is at least successful. Very often, I don't think remakes are, like, necessary, and I think they almost never even come close to surpassing the source movie. But part of the reason The Ring worked is that the plot itself was easily adaptable in terms of like specific anxieties to the country that it's in, right? So the whole like you watch a videotape and then you die 7 days later, that's not something that has like cultural specificity. Like it's not about a particular style of like haunting or a particular style of like demon supernatural entity. It's just a videotape. So it was, I think, a smart choice, I guess, if you have to remake a horror movie, was to do The Ring. And then The Ring, I think, also has like a very strong visual style that most other remakes don't manage to achieve. I mean, also, The Ring to me is the scariest movie I've ever seen because, fun story, I watched it by myself in the dark when I was like 14, and I was so scared once it ended that I couldn't get up and turn off the TV. So, and this was back in like the Stone Age when streaming wasn't a thing yet. It was a videotape I had literally rented from Blockbuster. So the screen goes to snow after the tape is over. So I just sat there in my bed, terrified, staring at the snow until my aunt rescued me. So...
I agree with you on all of that, though. Like, and I think it's interesting to bring up The Ring because for me, I found the ending of Dead Friend Forever was a little reminiscent of The Ring in certain aspects, which we'll get into. But yeah, The Ring is fucking like that's a horror movie. Like, even when I was researching horror in general to kind of like interact with fandom and such during these, Dead Friend Forever's airing, like I had looked up The Ring and even the fucking poster. Dude, like...
Just the eye.
I thought she was going to come at me through my computer screen, and I was like, girl, it's just me. I don't even have, like, a cat to eat my body. Like, you can't do me like this. Like...
Sorry, if we're talking about The Ring for a second. I don't remember seeing anything like that special effect of her crawling out of the TV up to that point. Like, that was a very, like, unexpected thing to happen, because like that's kind of where any like reference to that comes from. It comes from The Ring of something exiting like the digital world and entering the physical world. But like when that happens in the movie, that is like the worst, most actually terrifying jump scare that I think I've ever watched.
And it's interesting too, because like when I think of snow, I think of The Ring, and I also think of Poltergeist. Like if we're talking about horror and stuff, I feel like Poltergeist is another one that's like baby's first horror because it's...
Yeah, I don't think Poltergeist is
scary. I don't
think
Poltergeist is scary at all, but it's considered like a horror classic, And I think it's really because it's that whole time and place, right? Because Poltergeist also came out, I want to say, in the 80s.
I think
And it, again, speaks to that anxiety of, like, suburban life not being safe. Because that's... The child is taken, right? It's not by a slasher villain, but the cute little child is taken by something else, something dangerous, something lurking within, the safe walls and propriety of suburbia, and the family has to remove themselves completely from it to be safe again.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that's what slashers, when they were originally conceived and when they originally at their peak were addressing. And you can kind of see as we've gone away from that culturally and we've kind of yo-yoed back and forth between liberal and conservative values in our general American society, that slashers have kind of dovetailed into kind of two forms, which you have like your Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honeys and then you have your like Freaky and The Final Girls, Happy Death Day, Totally Killer, which are all horror comedies that are making kind of meta fun on those aesthetics of a slasher film.
Happy Death Day is, I did not expect to like that movie as much
It
as
is
I
such
did.
a fun
But
movie.
I really did enjoy it. I was going to say, so kind of bringing it back to Dead Friends Forever. So if you're looking at Dead Friends Forever, and to me, like the kind of anxieties they're addressing, I think it actually makes a lot of sense, particularly because it is something that was written, at least in part, by Salmon, who also wrote Triage and Manner of Death, because all three of these stories share this idea of something bad is happening under the surface. There are secrets that are hurting people. There are people who should be acting one way because they hold a position of power, not acting in that way, and kind of getting away with it until you can kind of scrabble those truths out into the light. So to me, I think that's kind of the anxiety you're looking at more, is an anxiety around the idea that the way the world works is not fair, and that a small choice can snowball into something that ruins your life, that every little thing that happens can start like a ball rolling down a hill that ends in spectacular awfulness. And I think that's a very different kind of anxiety than we're in the suburbs and the suburbs are no longer 100% safe. Along with like what I mentioned about like the characters themselves being the most memorable part, that's sort of like the biggest step away from slashers in Dead Friends Forever.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I think at the end of the day, to me, Dead Friend Forever is just not a slasher. Like, point blank, period.
No, it's not.
I do think this segues in nicely to like what type of horror Dead Friend Forever is. I would argue that it's psychological horror is probably one of the easiest ways to slot it. It plays a lot with the genre, but if I was to compare comps to it, like comparable titles to it, I would say something like Girl from Nowhere, I think, is a really strong comparable title. Specifically in season 1, personally, I don't like season 2, but I know people that do. Your mileage may vary, whatever. But Girl from Nowhere is a Thai horror show that originally came out in 2018. And it's kind of an anthology series in the same vein as like Ryan Murphy's American Horror series, except those seasons are about like a singular story and they just change every season. This one, every episode changes place and location with the through line of its protagonist character Nano, who is extremely similar to Tomi, which was a Junji Ito character, who's a horror writer in Japan and extremely influential in the genre, especially in Asia. And she is, we don't know. We don't know what she is. She could be a deity.
She's something.
She could be a demon. She could be, you know, a retributional angel or something, you know, spiritual. We don't know what she is, but the bitch immortal, I'll tell you that.
She is. Well, and I think too, something interesting that I think like Girl from Nowhere and Dead Friends Forever kind of what's scary about Nano is that there's no like explaining yourself with her. Like there's no context. She's not, whatever she is, she's not going to be like, okay, now tell me your extenuating circumstances. She doesn't care. Like you are purely being judged on what you did, regardless of why you did it. And I think it's kind of the same thing is happening in Dead Friends Forever with, so I guess if you don't want to know who the killer is, like stop at this point. New, who is increasingly committing violence regardless of what the people he's killing did or didn't do.
Yeah. And like it's interesting with Nano because she throughout season 1 will kind of give people options. Like she gives you the option to like not be a shit person. And then people will be shit people, and she's like, oh, well, you did it to yourself. I like, there's an episode, I want to say it's episode maybe 4 or 5, where she interacts with this one boy, and he steals shit. But he doesn't do anything with it, and he's not stealing from, like, the poor or anything. Like, he's stealing mostly from, like, rich people and stuff like that. And it's really just a call for him to, like, his father, his rich dad or whatever, to pay attention to him in some meaningful way. And she doesn't deliver retribution onto him, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, it's you know what it is? It's more about calling out the hypocrisy of it with Nano. And I think even too, I think very much with like Dead Friends Forever, with this whole idea of like, not only did you do these horrible things you did to Non, who is the secret that they've all been keeping, that this other classmate, Non, who the other boys use very badly, is dead because of things that the group did to him. And I think you see that a lot with the way New is reacting, where it's like, it wasn't enough that you hurt my brother. It's also that you kept living your lives and you never said anything.
It's the lack of remorse, I think, is what the narrative, not New specifically, because New doesn't care about remorse. He's on the train and it's off the track. Like, with Nano, if a character does feel some semblance of remorse or whatever, she is usually, like, kinder.
She's just, I think, a little bit, like, cool story still.
Yeah.
A lot of the time.
Yeah, like, and I bring up Girl from Nowhere because the last 2 episodes of season 1, which are titled BFF, which I think is very interesting just in a comparison. Like, I don't know if it was directly an homage to that, because Girl from Nowhere was hugely popular, both in Thailand, the Philippines, Vietnam, from what I remember researching and such, but all over different Asian countries. And so much so that when it got on Netflix, it became even more popular, and then Netflix produced a season 2. Again, don't really like season 2, but your mileage may vary. You get a budget, and all of a sudden it's just shock value, gore and stuff. And I'm like, okay, Eli Roth. Anyway.
Right. It's also like the fact that it was shot on an iPhone is kind of part of what makes it scary. It almost kind of lends like an analog quality to it that I think works for season 1 at least.
And I think what makes it unsettling too is that, like, you have to grapple with this idea of, like, did these people deserve what they got? And the idea of, like, this kind of endless torture on them sometimes. Like, certain episodes will end.
Yeah.
And you kind of, it's always implied that, like, this is going to stay with these characters for, like, ever. And it's always with young people, too, because Nana always poses as, like, a high school girl. But in the episodes BFF, she's coming back from, like, a class reunion for high school. And you see what they did to her, this class, when they were in high school. And it's, it's the bullying, it's all fucked up, it's et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And then you see that they have not changed as adults. They're also all still bad people.
Another interesting thing to me is they also both share a very specific romantic betrayal of, like, the pivotal character. So honestly, the reveal about Nano and the fact that Void Boyfriend was a real person fucking actually surprised me. I was very startled. But you also have the same thing in Dead Friends Forever, where you have Non and Fee, who were also dating, and Fee ended up betraying. I don't know that I would call it betrayal. To me, it feels much more like had a very intense teenager reaction that was not good. I don't think he was setting out to, like, betray Non. Anyways, had this betrayal of Non as well, and kind of did not stand up for Non when Non needed him.
Yeah, I guess you could call it, like, kind of an emotional betrayal.
Yeah, it was not great. Like, that was not a good thing that Fee did.
But it was also a very, like, young adult thing. And that was my thing with the show in general. A lot of it within the lens of, like, okay, these are, like, 17, 18, 19-year-olds. I was like, yeah, y'all would act like this.
Yeah, to me, I thought that was really interesting because not only are they even in the present still not that old, like, they're just graduating high school. Everything that happened with Non happened 2 years prior. So they were even younger at that point. They were like 15 and 16. They were very much teenagers with, for several of them, a lot of really intense things happening at home, because I do care about extenuating circumstances. And like Nano, a lot of extenuating circumstances that kind of flavored why they made the choices that they did.
I think those extenuating circumstances are important to the actual narrative that's being built here.
I agree.
Because I don't think Dead Friend Forever is exactly like Girl from Nowhere. They are similar to me in tone, in stylistic choices, and certain things like that, but they are not the same in, like, narrative intent.
Yeah, because, like, Nano is not actually hurt in any way, like, emotionally or permanently physically by what is done to her, versus all of these people in Dead Friends Forever are just humans.
Yeah, like, literal humans, like...
Yeah, are actually getting hurt and dying.
We don't know what Nano is, but she's fine.
Yeah, she's fine.
Like, she don't care. But yeah, like, in Dead Friend Forever, and it kind of goes back to what you were saying about Salmon, who is one of the writers. I believe the series has 4 writers, and I do want to just be cognizant of that because, one, that's very typical of a show to have more than one writer. And to me, it's just important that just because the most visible and well-known writer doesn't get all the credit for a show, like, I see that a lot in fandom. That's a separate type of discussion. But I do agree that, like, with Salmon's work, you do see this underbelly almost, like that through line of, like, there's something wrong with the powers that be. Like, authority figures are failing.
Something is being covered up.
Yeah, and you have all these small moments that lead to a bigger and bigger issue. Like, I just watched Triage at your recommendation, I believe.
I'm so glad you liked it.
I did. They really earned that fucking happy ending. Jesus Christ.
Did they? They put in the work, put in the hours.
Ay, Dios mío. It was interesting. Like, the more I think about Triage, now I'm thinking about Dead Friend Forever, is that there were so many little things that led to, even though you knew that the hospital was an organ trafficking factory or whatever, fairly ish early on, like you could put the pieces together.
Yeah, like the missing kidney came up pretty quick.
Yeah. But it was all these little things that actually like built towards the characters realizing it, and like how intricate the little system of stealing organs was, and how many different characters who didn't have anything necessarily to do with each other.
Yeah.
And I thought that's interesting. And you kind of see that in Dead Friend Forever, but more streamlined.
Yeah.
One of the things I disagree with fandom on in general is that like it was one factor that caused Nan's essential downfall and breakdown, because I feel like that's not giving the narrative enough credit, to be honest, because it's a lot of little things, and it's a slow burn almost when you get to those flashbacks. That's why we had 5 episodes flashbacks.
Well, one, just as an aside, this show also has organ trafficking, and I love Salmon for that, just because it's such a recurring theme in the things that she writes. Helps write, because you're right about her not being the only writer. How many times can I say right? But I enjoyed that very much, that it was like, oh yeah, it's like Quentin Tarantino and feet. It's Salmon and organ trafficking.
Do you think she'll have organ trafficking in 4 minutes? Like now
there's
a surgeon, so.
I hope so. There's a surgeon. I want it to be true.
But yeah, for me, like Dead Friend Forever, like we're gonna get into the nitty gritty of like what I would qualify it as far as type of horror. Psychological, I think, suits the most, because psychological horror is usually about like internal fears or some sort of larger societal fears or something like that. Like Get Out is psychological horror, and it's about very specific fears, and like that slow burn of Nan's downfall. I don't like saying downfall.
I don't like saying downfall either. One of the things I found frustrating about fandom's reaction is I felt that there was such a tendency to want to say this thing that happened to Nan is what ruined his life, which I think is, one, it flattens Nan as a character a lot, and he's kind of wonderfully layered, I think, so flattening him is like a big loss to the story that's being told.
Mm-hmm.
And it also flattens all of the other characters. It also flattens New, particularly I think when it comes to like their family and their parents and that whole situation that was like pre-existingly not good.
That was one of the things that I liked about the show, because when I think about like history, or I think about socio-political like topics and things like that, or like film history in and of itself, because I'm a big film fan, it's never like one thing.
No,
it's always multiple things that intersect, so like why was there a big boom of like movie musicals and stuff? Like, well, so for a lot of factors, it wasn't all just because American in Paris, which is a boring movie, but I have watched it, did really well and won like a bunch of Oscars. Like, it's not just that, it's not even just that like Mary Poppins did really well at the box office, so we got a slew of new musicals, or what was it, Sound of Music I think was first, and then Mary Poppins, so. and then West Side Story, etc., etc. Yeah. And like the mega movie musical in and of itself was to compete with like TV, like so you have all these intersections and all these small factors, which is why I liked that chunk of flashbacks, which I think in a less well-written show, that kind of chunk of flashbacks, because I want to say, what was it, like 4 or 5 episodes?
Something like that, yeah. Like it was a slew of them. And like right in the middle, too.
Exactly, I don't think it would have worked as well, but it actually works really well, because they give you the build-up, at the murder McMansion.
Because they set you up to have feelings about all of these characters. And they give you just enough time that I think you feel confident in your feelings about them, about who you think deserves to die in this horror movie, who deserves to live, who's in the right, who's in the wrong. And then they're like, however, there's more that you don't know. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, that didn't go the way that I thought it did.
Yeah, which is why to me it's that psychological style horror, because it's literally peeling back the layers. You think one thing, you get used to that one thing that you're thinking, that one thing that you're feeling, and then it showcases like, well, actually, and I feel like the show even continues to do that with T's story.
Yes, I think it does.
Why don't you take this T subject away? You get us started on this one.
So T ended up being my favorite character in the show. I think he is an incredibly interesting character. I think the way he's treated in the story, even just in the way his story was presented, I think is very interesting. Like having the second to last episode be entirely about him is a very interesting choice, since up to that point he had just been part of the overall friends group. I think his relationship with White is very, very interesting. So I think kind of to talk about T, we have to at least spend a couple minutes explaining what happened to Non in order for T's actions to make sense.
Do a speed run.
Exactly. Basic thing is the group of friends is 5 guys, and they decide that they're going to make a movie for a competition. None of them are able to write the movie, so they see Non is a writer, so they convince Non to write this movie for them and then be part of making it. As that happens, things start to snowball with Non. Ultimately, like the issue that happens here is that these 5 dudes don't really like Non. Non is a very lonely person, and I think he's aware that they don't really like him, but he doesn't have friends. Like they call him Greasy. So kind of the downfall of Non is about the various ways that they all use him to get things that they want. They use him to write this movie, so that way Poor can be a movie director. They blame like a broken camera on him, so Top doesn't have to tell Poor that he broke the camera. And T especially ends up recruiting Non to participate in some mafia illegal gambling under the table shit, because T is coming from that world. His uncle is like the local crime boss, an organ trafficker. A lot of the physical danger to Non's safety especially comes from getting involved with the mafia. So in some ways T is responsible for, I guess, versus the more psychological side, which I don't actually think is better, but the more like just using him and leaving him alone. T, I think, is interesting because even at the outset, he is shown to be a little bit apart from the rest of the 5 friends because he has a boyfriend, a little tiny twink of a boyfriend named White. Poor White, who has been dragged along on this friend vacation that he did not want to go on. White did not want to be at this murder McMansion cabin.
The youths won't get this joke, but White is channeling Big Dante from Clerks. I wasn't even supposed to be here today.
Yes,
Energy.
yes. He's like 100% there as an emotional support boyfriend, and White did nothing wrong. Eventually, we're gonna get into like fan reactions and the idea that White did nothing wrong, people didn't want to believe or did not think was true. Regardless, in many ways, too, I think in kind of the early episodes and the early flashbacks, T is kind of the one who seems to be making the least effort to even superficially be kind to Non. He's the one who is like the most reserved. He's like the most brusque. There's like a stoicism to him, I think. He comes across as like very calculated.
Yeah, I think the actor that is in the role too is a good choice as well, because out of all the main cast, he is, I mean, I don't find him intimidating, but you know, in terms of like the main cast, he's the tallest.
He is the tallest.
Yeah, he's like the tallest, and he seems really physically imposing. He's got this like really strong, like square jaw type of thing, and you know, he walks around with his hands in his pockets, and he just seems like that type of dude that like, you know, don't mess with me, stoic character.
I would argue too that he looks the oldest out of the cast.
And I think kind of what you're getting at is like those opening episodes set him up to be like the most physically imposing antagonist in comparison to Poor, who is not especially physically imposing at all. I want to say that Non is probably taller-ish, you know?
I think so. It depends on whether they had us in heels or not.
And that's something that I feel like people keep discounting about Barcode. Barcode is like a tall dude. Like,
Barcode is a tall dude.
He's not tiny, like, at all. And it's interesting to see fans kind of babyfy him, because I'm like, he's not a tiny dude. He's not especially a skinny or thin dude either. That's a whole other thing. But, like, as far as, yeah, the main cast goes, like, T does have that kind of more, like, physically imposing statuesqueness to him that I think connects to, like, what you're saying about how his connection to Non is very connected to, like, the violence done to Non physically and not emotionally necessarily. I mean, it is emotional to get beat up.
Yes, people do have feelings about that.
So I get that aspect, but like as far as like the actual super psychological damage that Non takes, it's more about the bullying and the isolation that these characters put him through. The videotape that Jin takes and posts
Oh, yeah.
online of Non and his tutor. It was a tutor,
Tutor, yeah. Mr. Kang.
and the mental toll his parents always fighting and kind of scapegoating him take on
Yeah.
him. The weight of owing money in
Yeah.
terms of debt, like that takes, I would say, even a harder toll on him than like getting beat up.
Yeah, I would agree.
And I think kind of connecting this back to, because one of the things about Non is he's kind of set up as that character. And then we learn later in the show that, because he gets a whole episode pretty much of his point of view.
Yeah, he does. And it's
And
really
this was the episode
interesting.
where I feel like things really turned around in terms of like his character for me. He became much more interesting after this episode. But you learn things about like T is poor.
Yeah. And I think, too, something that I noticed kind of as I was looking back at it is that all of the other characters are firmly placed within like a high schooler's life. Like you see Poor's parents get him out of trouble. Fluke talks about wanting to be a doctor and make his parents proud. Top is like, my parents will kill me if I have to pay money for this thing that I ruined. Even like with Fee, like Fee's dad is like a whole part of this thing, but you don't see that for T. So I think he comes across as like more dangerous because he doesn't feel as much like he's connected to other people, if that makes sense.
It does. He feels isolated in a way that's different from Non. Like, I would argue that
Yes.
Non wants connection, which is why he stays with this friend group that does not want him around.
Nope.
But he is desperate for connection. And T doesn't seem desperate for connection as much. Like, he almost seems like he would be, like, loner-esque type. Like, if he was a manga character, he'd be that dude that's looking out the window. He'd be a Sasuke type, Like, and when you learn T's backstory, I feel like that informs a lot of those earlier choices.
Yeah.
Because Non's parents, I won't undercut this, like they're not great. Like they are not super supportive. The brother Nu is clearly the golden child to Non's scapegoat. I will say that he has a roof over his head. He has like the bare essentials. Before people get on me, I'm not saying that they were good parents. They weren't. But they are at least some form of support. They did care about him in some way.
Like they were parents.
Yeah.
You would not argue that they weren't fulfilling the role of parents, even if they were fulfilling it badly.
Yeah. Whereas with T, you learn he is actually the parent.
Yeah, he is parenting his dad.
Because his father is clearly mentally ill.
Severely mentally ill.
And the only reason he's working with his, gangster uncle is to afford medicine and literally food for himself. Like this is about survival,
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I feel like it connects to what you were saying earlier about Salmon's writing of that undercurrent of like authority or people that are meant to fulfill specific roles that are poised to like protect and help people not doing so, and how like you peel back the layers and you see how it's failed certain people. And I feel like that's what we learn with T. Like he doesn't have a home life. Like he does not have a viable adult figure in his life at all.
Yeah, there is nobody looking out for T.
Yeah, he has his uncle who uses him and puts him in violent situations.
Organ trafficker uncle.
Yeah, like who puts him in violent situations and is constantly holding the threat of, no medical care for his father because he won't have any funds, and like starvation and homelessness for both his father and himself. Those are his options, like work for my criminal uncle or starve and die. And not being able to like take care of my father, which speaks to like larger issues of like society and how society fails our most vulnerable participants. And I feel like that's something that fandom really didn't want to discuss. It's interesting because I saw fandom discussing how society fails, but it was always about Non.
Yeah, how they failed Non, which Non did get failed, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
Non very much was failed.
I totally agree with that. It's just like it also failed T.
It did. So kind of overall, for me, what I really loved about T is, and especially the way they structured it again with using that second to last episode to kind of hit you with T's story, is kind of the big question I'd say overall through all of the shit in the cabin, all of the chases and the murder temple and everything that happened, is that Nu and Fee don't know what happened to Non. He disappeared. And I think that's a really interesting thing to keep in mind here, is that we don't know that Non is dead for a lot of the show. He's just missing. So what they're focused on isn't just retribution, or at least they're not both just focused on retribution. A lot of what's driving them is they want to know, like the closure thing you think of, like they want to know where his body is, that kind of thing. So the whole show sets this up where T is the one who gets Non involved with the mafia. He initially recruits him to be doing things they're translated as horse accounts. I haven't heard of this, so I don't know if there's like a different English term for it. So basically the idea is Non has these bank accounts. Murder trafficker uncle will like transfer money into those bank accounts, and then he moves that money along to people who are part of traffickers' gambling ring. So I think it counts as money laundering to me.
I was going to say, it just sounds like money laundering.
Yeah, it's just money laundering. So he gets involved in that. And what happens is that for a reasonably good reason, Non does not send one of those like 200,000 bot deposits onto the gambler. He uses it for something else. And that kind of snowballs his involvement with the mafia in terms of like, oh, now he not only owes the mafia money, but he screwed over organ trafficker uncle. Like he specifically fucked with his money, and he is now on a very dangerous shit list. So what I love about how it's structured is that kind of leading up to this episode, because we don't know what happened to Non, we see that he kind of ends up in the custody of murder uncle along with the tutor, and then that episode ends, and then the next episode starts, and it's suddenly we are exclusively in T's point of view. And through T's point of view, kind of like we've talked about, we kind of established that T is not a member of the mafia in a way that is like a choice for him, right? So he's there because he's related to his uncle. He's doing this at all because he is, like you said, parenting his dad. And in order for murder uncle to give him the money for medicine for his dad, he has to participate in this criminal underworld. Like we find out that like he's also an extremely like lonely person. He is shouldering an immense burden way beyond what any 16-year-old should have to. He doesn't have anybody even like nominally looking out for him. That's actually one of the things I found most sad about T, is that a lot of times with characters like this, there will at least be some like kind old woman who runs a shop that sort of acknowledges the humanity of that lonely character. And he doesn't even have something like that.
He's got no lonely old women to like give him a lollipop or nothing.
Yeah, and I don't know that it's explicitly laid out, but the impression I got is that also none of his friends know anything about his home life.
I would argue that's pretty implied.
Yeah, I think it's pretty heavily implied. And it's also, they don't care to ask. Like,
yeah.
From everything we've seen about these guys, they would never occur to them to ask. Like, it's not important. So what we end up seeing is that, contrary to everything you've kind of been primed to expect, when it comes down to it, when murder uncle has physical custody, I guess, of Non, T stands up for Non. And it's very unexpected. T stands up and is like, don't kill him. He's my friend. He doesn't deserve this. We can figure something out. Have him work for you and pay off the debt. And then I'll work too and help him pay off the debt. He not only kind of like protests, but he does everything he can to save Non. And he's successful for a little bit. His uncle agrees, like, fine, this kid can work in the casino until he pays off his debt, which will never happen because mafia interest rates are notoriously difficult for borrowers. And you see that T really does do what he can. He picks up another job. He is helping Non at the illegal gambling house. He is doing the best he can to handle this situation so that Non will live.
Within what little power he has.
Exactly. Within what little power he has.
I think that's the thing that folks have to kind of acknowledge. Like, T doesn't really have any power here. And I think that's something that the show was emphasizing throughout. Not specifically about T, but about the characters in general. Non doesn't have any power. T doesn't have any power. Even Poor didn't really have power so much as he got power through his parents.
Yeah, he had rich parents. Yeah.
They were rich and they were part of the government. So really, like, the folks that have that foundational power, like, Fee doesn't have any power, his cop father does. It's all these adults that are in charge, these established adults that are in charge. You know, Fee's father, Poor's parents, you know, T's uncle even. They all have the actual power here to make changes in these characters' lives, as they should, because they are the adult authority figures, and exactly. They don't. They make things worse. Like, Nod's parents also have power as his parents to be support for him, and they fail him in that.
Yeah, and I think even them too, interesting to me for them too, because they also are shown to have the least power of the adults. I think that's part of what makes them interesting, is that they are responsible for these two kids and kind of get on Non particularly for what he does and embarrassing them and like not providing that support. And then they turn around and they're kind of treated the same way as Non is by his friends, by the other adults. in this show. So, which I like because it kind of emphasizes again that this is a larger society problem.
Yeah, this is a societal issue. This is like a structural issue. We're only seeing like the microcosm of it. You know, like we're seeing a very specific point of view of like much, much larger problems, which is why I think the ending ends the way it does, because it's like, how do you solve these? You kind of don't. Like, it's beyond the bounds of what this particular show could even try to like accomplish, you know?
Yeah.
And I feel like because people are so focused on like retribution for Non, and I think it's really important to note too in like T's episode, Non does not forgive him, which I think is valid.
Non is never even like warm to him. Like, Non is allowed to be angry and furious.
And I liked that. Like, I think that's good. I think that fits the character too, you know? And I think that's valid. I think it doesn't have to be an either or.
Yeah.
Is my thing. It's like this show is richer when you have empathy for multiple different characters in multiple different ways. I did end up having a lot of empathy for T because he does try within his very limited power. Like, it's honestly really naive of him in a way that's super understandable as a young adult, like as a 17, 18-year-old, to be like, I didn't know my uncle was gonna kill like him. Like, which watching, I'm like, yeah, of course he would. But like, I'm also a grown adult.
Right, and it's understandable that T might think that, oh, well, like, Non is a kid. He's a teenager. Like, maybe my uncle kills adults who fucked up, but, like, he wouldn't kill a teenager. Like, he wouldn't kill a kid.
Yeah, and, like, his uncle said he wouldn't, and then he was like, I lied, like gangsters do.
Because I'm a liar.
Just, why you always lying?
Why you always lying? Yes.
That on repeat. To me, that was when T felt most his actual age, was when he was on his knees begging his uncle, like, please don't kill my friend. And yeah, you know, it showed that T is still very much a teenager. He is the same age as Non. He is unsupported in every facet pretty much of his life. And he is surrounded by violence all the time.
Yeah.
Like, and just like this ever-looming threat.
Yeah, well, that's something we talked about, which, like, clicked for me very strongly as I was thinking about the show, that while obviously getting Non involved in the mafia was not a good choice, what I realized is that from T's perspective, he's not putting Non in any more danger than T himself is in every day. And because I think his standards of what counts as, like, danger are so miscalibrated due to his home situation, I think that casts his willingness to get Non involved in the horse accounts in a very different light than how fandom took it, which was very like purposefully, you know, he might die, so I'm gonna have Non do this because I don't care about him, which also kind of conveniently ignores that Poor and Jin and Fluke, I think, also all got involved in the horse accounts. So, like, Non was not the only one in that situation. Ultimately, one of the things a lot of people in fandom disliked the most that I liked the most is we find out that no one killed Non, in the sense that, like, no one stabbed him in the neck, no one shot him, no one strangled him. Non died from injuries and exhaustion and probably malnutrition from having been beaten up and then essentially working as a slave in this gambling house. And it was just a very quiet death. Like, it looks like he died in his sleep. And people felt it was very anticlimactic.
I was just gonna say that. I saw a lot of people saying it was anticlimactic.
And to me, I'm like, I love this because that's the point. The point is that even though there was no, like, active slasher murder, like, there was no axe in the back or whatever, he's still dead, though.
I also think part of it is that folks wanted a clear-cut person to blame, like character to blame specifically. Yeah. And I don't think the show wanted to give easy answers like that. Like, obviously, T is a part of what happened to Non and what led to Non's death. But again, the person that was willing to cut him up and deliver his organs like steaks was the uncle. Yep. Like, T had nothing to do with that. And ultimately, like, his uncle would have kept Non. I saw a lot of people saying that, like, this was wrong because, like, you know, Non paid off his debt. And I'm like, that's not how debt works.
That's not how the mafia works.
It's also, not how the mafia works. Like, and his uncle even says something about how, like, his debt is small, but he's still going to make Non work until he drops. Because that's, like, the point. Like, he's the one with the power, therefore he is going to set the rules, and the rules will constantly change to favor himself. That's why T can't leave.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, too, there's a real tendency to want to locate Non purely in a victim position in a way that I felt flattened him because it completely removed or ignored the agency that he had within his own story that I thought made it more interesting. Because it was Non who decided not to forward that mafia money along to the person he was supposed to me, in a way that was in some ways trying to appease this friends group. And obviously that does not mean he deserved to have his organs trafficked or to die alone, hurt, and starving in a illegal gambling house. But I think a lot of people really, really, really didn't want to at least see Non as an active participant in what happened to him. And they really wanted, like you said, to place all of the blame on one person. They wanted to find out who killed him or which people killed him. And for the answer to be that no one killed him, that a series of bad choices and shitty things snowballed out of control with this kid. This is also something I think fandom ignored a lot, who had pre-existing mental health issues and comes from a family where everybody has mental health issues, how all of that snowballed into this kid being dead. And I think that's a much grayer story that a lot of people had a really strong reaction against. Like what I saw was so many people talking about the ending of Dead Friends Forever didn't work because they did all this work to set up expectations and then they didn't fulfill them. For me, I was like, yeah, that's the point. Like that was on purpose. I don't think this was bad writing. I think this was a very deliberate part of the story that makes it more interesting and more nuanced.
Yeah, that was that was one of the things I was also being really annoying about with fandom and such, in terms of like meta that I was seeing, was this idea that horror is supposed to give you catharsis, like as a genre. And most routinely, horror does not give you catharsis. It's not a staple of the genre in and of itself. Like, I'm going to bring up Midsommar, and I'm going to spoil the ending. Sorry for folks who haven't seen Midsommar. You should. It's vastly unnerving. But the ending of Midsommar always had caused a lot of debate because people had thought it was a happy ending. And then there's people that are like, no, she got inducted into like a white supremacist cult. And she does.
And she does.
If you look at the story, you have to really think about, did these people deserve to die in like a human sacrificial way? And did she really find happiness? I disagree that she did. She found just new people that would manipulate her. Like, this is a society in Midsommar where elderly are forced to kill themselves.
Yeah, that scene wigged me out.
Yeah, after they reach a certain age. Like, that is not a good society.
It's not great.
Like, even if she survives to the age of,
I think it's 75.
Yeah, something like that. Like, she literally has like a meat packaging expiration date on her. Like, that's horrible. But like, it's one of those things where it's like, that's not a cathartic ending. That's unnerving and tragic. And a lot of horror ends that way.
Yeah, I think what kind of like Midsommar, I can't remember the name of the character, and non-story share is a horrifying, intensely like dread heavy inevitability. Once the wheels on the thing started going, the chances to get off this track to find a way out got less and less and less until eventually it was a point of no return. And what happened was just what was gonna happen. And you're just watching it happen, knowing this is not right, this is not good, this is not what should be happening, but that's the story.
Yeah, and that's what makes it horror.
Yeah, exactly.
Those core tenets are what make it horror. And I feel like this kind of goes back to what we were kind of talking about earlier about how a lot of folks who were engaging in this show hadn't seen a lot of horror, because like Scream is not like this. Scream is straightforward.
Scream is not like this at all.
No, and Scream is fun. That's what it is, you know, and most slashers are like that. They're supposed to be fun. Like, there's a reason why there's a slasher for almost every holiday. Have y'all seen Leprechaun? It's stupid and awful and offensive, but like,
but it's fun.
It's fun, you know. Thanksgiving, which came out. Well, how can you make a slasher about Thanksgiving? I don't know, but they did.
Black Christmas is a lot of fun.
Oh my god. And there's like 3 of them. There's like 3 or 4 remakes of the original Black Christmas.
My personal favorite Christmas horror movie is Krampus.
Oh my god, Krampus.
I love Krampus. It's so campy and weird. I love it. But yeah.
Like, those types of films are meant to be, like, a lot of slashers are meant to be entertaining. The OGs, the originals, like the really good ones, they're meant to be deeper, you know, in actual like movies.
I would also argue, too, a lot of the OGs are not particularly scary now.
Yeah.
Like, when I watch them, I don't find them scary at all.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like, Nightmare doesn't scare me deeply. Friday, the one with Mama Voorhees, that does not scare. Kevin Bacon scares me a little bit, but that's a whole separate thing. But, like, Texas Chainsaw Massacre isn't really scary.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre is so fucking weird, too.
It's
like,
very
it's
weird.
So strange.
It's so weird. And its development as a franchise is also the most out of pocket of all the slasher franchises. Like, they just somehow progressively got worse and worse, which is saying something when my favorite is Jason X, which sounds like a porno, but it's Jason in space.
Does?
It's not a slasher porno, it's just Jason in space.
As Jason should be. Why shouldn't Jason be in space?
But yeah, for catharsis, like, I saw fandom having this expectation of catharsis. This is kind of like Only Friends, I'm just saying. But, like, to me, that was never where the show was going to go. And that's where I had hoped the show wouldn't go, because I didn't want by catharsis, because that felt too easy.
Yeah, exactly.
And I feel like if this is a good segue into, like, general fandom expectations, we kind of were discussing this just because of the way fandom kind of reacted to T, and then, you know, the catharsis thing and such, and kind of like how we discussed fandom viewing non and such. But like you also saw this very strongly with like Fee versus New.
Yeah. Oh man.
And in general, like fandom theories that were latched onto very prominently and very stringently.
Yeah, it was really fascinating to watch Fee get ejected from the club of people that were determined worthy of living.
That's such a good way of putting it.
So the most common like ending I saw people wanting or anticipating was an ending where New lived and killed everybody else, Non was somehow not dead, and White also survived because White hadn't done anything. Or White was actually Non the whole time, and the brothers were kind of going to go off into the sunset, somehow leaving behind a cabin full of dead teenagers with at least one set of politically important parents.
The White as Non theory was a personal favorite because it was so telenovela. Like, I was like, oh, I've watched this before.
I would not have like thought it was a good writing, but it would have made me laugh of all of the options people were talking about. Like, there would have been like a kind of humor in that.
Like, it was very Ugly Betty.
What I found really interesting about these theories is, one, how much people were willing to assume that Non was actually not dead. Which I didn't at any point in the show think that Non wasn't dead. Like, I was very confident that Non was dead the whole time. But a lot of people were like, no, he's gonna come back. And to me, like, there was kind of a conflation in what I saw between what the show was telling you and what people wanted to happen. Because, like, yeah, you do want Non to secretly be alive somewhere. Anyone who's had something horribly bad happen to someone they care about, you want so badly for the universe to align and be like, just kidding, I'm taking it back. This horrible thing that you thought you endured, just kidding. It was like some kind of test of brotherly love or whatever. And now I'm going to take it back because you showed yourself to be worthy of not experiencing this tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
The more, especially once we got into the flashbacks, I was like, no. Like,
nah, that dude dead.
It would have cheapened, I think, that twist, if they had gone for it, and I don't think they ever meant to, would have completely undermined everything they'd said in these flashbacks, particularly about the structural issues, about society, about how people are failed.
I agree. From like a strictly like narrative, like storytelling structure, it wouldn't have made sense. Like, I was willing to keep an open mind just because, you know, writers be doing shit. I watched Ryan Murphy shows before, unfortunately. Like, shit be happening. Glee was a wild ride.
Like, and there are plenty of horror movies who I think are completely undermined by twists like that. It's not uncommon in horror for kind of in an effort to reach that shock value. There's something like that, but it's almost never effective.
Exactly. Like, for me, I was more confused about how it would work in a way that wasn't going to be convoluted.
Yes.
And that was another thing that I kept seeing, again, because I got into, you know, the show fairly late, was a lot of these theories were unrealistic solely because there was simply not enough time.
Yes.
Which is an issue I see with kind of fandom at large, not even just BL fandom, but just like fandom in general when you're a fan of like moving media, you know, so film, television, etc. is a lot of people just don't, they get wrapped up in the fandom aspect of it, you know?
Yeah.
And they don't think about like the production aspect of these things, which I totally get, you know? I'm a weirdo and I think about those things more. Like, I have a very doyalist point of view when it comes to these things. So for me, when like, you know, people were like, well, the character Perth plays is going to come back and Non's going to secretly be alive and it's going to uncover all of this, and then White's going to be secretly involved somehow. And I was like, and with what time? There's 50 minutes to play with here.
Right. And like, what motivation would organ trafficking uncle have to remove Non from the casino, not kill him for organs if he was alive, and then also somehow let him go. Like, he has a lot on his plate. I don't think he has time to specifically fuck with Non that much.
Yeah, and it was. I saw a lot of people kind of theorizing about Perth's character. I believe that's the actor's name. I'm assuming so because that was the name I saw thrown around a lot.
I think it is Perth because I kept thinking, like, of the other Perth that was
That's
in
the one
Kinforce.
I kept thinking of.
Australian jump scare.
Yes, affectionate. But yeah, and I saw a lot of people kind of proposit that, like, why is Perth here?
He's there because T needs to talk to someone.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, in a narrative sense, he's there because T just needs someone to talk to that's not Non because he can't talk to Non because of their relationship, which makes sense. But you still need someone to bounce T's external thoughts on and challenge him, etc., etc. And in a, like, metatextual sense, he's there because he is an actor under the company, and they are throwing him in here.
Exactly.
For work.
Exactly.
It's really not that serious. Like, it's not more serious. Like, if the actor had been anybody else, like, had been played by Joe Schmo and not someone that fans recognized, no one would have paid any mind to him.
Oh, 100%. And I think, too, you see an extension of this even with White, where, again, with people being like, oh, Non is white, like, and being like, well, he has to have this other purpose. He can't just be T's boyfriend who didn't want to be there. And I'm like, well, he is that. But in a narrative sense, in a story construction sense, he represents collateral damage. He represents someone who had nothing to do with any of this, who's getting caught in the crossfire. He's there sort of for news behavior to escalate to a point at which you start thinking, this might be going a little far. And for T, he is there to show that T, after everything happened with Non, did try to do better. That T actually learned something from everything that happened. And in some sense, he is trying to make amends. And that is the narrative purpose that he serves. Like, that's the reason you have this character.
Exactly. Yeah, like, I saw a lot of folks that were kind of disappointed that White didn't have a backstory, but he does not need a backstory to function within the story.
He is backstory.
Yeah, exactly.
He's T's backstory.
Like, some characters are not meant to be expanded upon. They are meant to serve a function in the story. And that is essentially why White exists. He serves as a function within the story, not just for T, but also for Nu. You know, he is a representation of, like, the cycle of violence that Nu is continuing, where innocent people get wrapped up in that cycle and they pay consequences, sometimes with their lives. Like, I've seen people kind of say that Non and White have a lot of parallels. I don't disagree with that. I don't fully agree with it either, but I do think they both represent this sort of, like, innocence, I guess.
Yes. I mean, his name is White, for God's sakes.
Like, yeah, exactly. Like, I do think White and Non represent kind of, like, this sort of, like, innocence and such, and getting, you know, wrapped up into these circumstances, these situations, if you will. But yeah, White is really very much meant to just be a dude. I saw people being like, well, what did his flashbacks mean? What did his nightmare sequences mean in the last episode? And if you notice, his nightmare is so vastly different from everybody else's, all the other characters. Like, one, it's not violent at all.
No, it's rejection and, like, his own body.
It's very, very internal. And it's also very, very, like, typical of, like, a 17-year-old's worries. Like, does the person that I love me back, and will he leave me?
Oh, and he's getting ready to, like, go to college for 2 years. Is he gonna, like, get bored of me or no longer find me appealing? Versus everyone else who's getting their ass chased by Non through their worst fucking nightmares.
Yeah, exactly. And those dreams are, like, violent and, you know, sexually exploitative and very tied into their own guilt of, like, the, you know, the circumstances of what occurred in the show, like the plot.
Yes.
And it shows that White really was just some dude. It was just some guy. And that was the point, was that he was an innocent dude that Nu involved. Because I feel like people remove news agency a lot too.
Yeah.
When you think about it, Nu knew, oh gosh, he knew what he was doing. Fee at least just thought that they were gonna, like, drug some bitches and, like, you know, everybody was gonna get high and start truth serum themselves. But like, Nu came in knowing that people were gonna get murdered.
Like, my contention, and I think we've talked about this too, is that the big difference between Fee and Nu, to some extent, is that Fee expected to leave that cabin. He fully assumed assumed that everybody was going to walk out of that cabin. I don't think Non ever planned to walk out of that cabin. I think Non went in there knowing that he was going to kill everyone he could, and he was also probably going to die. I guess isn't to say I think he was like actively suicidal in that way, but I think New's life ended in that cabin when he was making this plan. He had nothing beyond that.
And that was the other thing. Like, I'd seen a lot of people start to compare Dead Friend Forever with The Glory, which is a Korean thriller drama. And for me, there's some specific reasons why that's a bad comparison. One, the characters are all vastly older. Like, the characters in The Glory are all in their 30s and 40s. Like, the core of The Glory is about the protagonist and what she had gone through in high school at the hands of, like, this group of rich kids. There's lots of class commentary in the show as well. But, like, when she is an adult, she goes back to them and she sees that they are all still awful people. Like, they are all still victimizing other people and committing crimes. And they have no remorse. That's the second big thing. That's the difference for me between the two shows, other than like literal genre differences, of which there are many, is that like you have characters like Fee and Jin and T who feel remorse for what part they played in Non's suffering.
Yeah, and I think who all genuinely cared about Non in some sense. Like, I think Jin you can kind of argue Jin's like the kind of scorned crush, that kind of like stereotypical like rejected guy, but I don't think that changes the fact that he did stand up for Non, not the best he could, but like he was the one that defended him from the rest of the group. I think he really did like Non. I absolutely believe that Fee loved Non in a 16-year-old way. That's also something I find very telling, is that so many people reacted to Fee starting to like Jin, to sleeping with Jin, as like a very cold betrayal, as though it is likely like that anybody stays with their 16-year-old boyfriend for like the rest of their life.
Very Heartstopper-esque thought.
It's very Heartstopper. And then even T, like, I think he at least cared about what happened. Even if he didn't really care about Non as, like, a person, like, intrinsically as, like, a real friend, I think he was genuinely concerned about what was going to happen to him and genuinely cared that he not just be murdered for organs.
And people could call that the baseline, and like, yeah, I agree. But like,
it
in
is
this
the baseline.
show, the baseline is still
Yeah.
But yeah, like, when I compared The Glory, it was specifically within a structural sense, because at the end of The Glory, or as we're getting to the end of The Glory, and the protagonist is about to get her revenge on all these people, of which only one of them dies. I thought it was very interesting that fandom essentially wanted all these characters to die for retribution purposes, and we're bringing up The Glory as a comparable title, forgetting the fact that, like, a lot of the characters in The Glory survive. Only one of them dies. Like, they all get their retribution in other ways, because retribution can come in many forms. It doesn't always have to be death. The other thing was, like, in a structural sense, like, as the protagonist is, gearing up for, like, the finale, blah, 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 the story sets up a way for her to live beyond the revenge. And the thing about Dead Friend Forever is it does not do the same for New. And it's like you said, New goes into that house probably knowing that he is also going to die, and probably being prepared for that at the very least. And I agree with that, because the narrative does not set up like an aftermath for him. There is no aftermath. He's going to kill all these people, or he'll die trying.
Yeah.
Like, and then, I mean, really, what would be for New afterwards? Like, he has no family, he has no money, he has no means, he has no job, he has a gap in his life because he's an adult man that went back to high school and infiltrated a group of teenagers.
I think it's very wild that no one in fandom ever talked about that he was actually... like a lot older than that. Not a lot older, but like when you're 16, I think 2 or 3 years older is like a big gap. That he was actually a high school graduate who decided to go back to high school. That's creepy. If you think about it,
creepy.
Like, that's a very concerning first choice to make in this plan to get the truth.
At the very least, he could have played like the food delivery guy instead of like killing the uncle who was delivering food in what is honestly the most graphic death in the show, I would argue.
And the most, like, to my mind, the most deliberate. I think it's very funny that a lot of fandom is, like, very convinced that New did not set that trap. Even though I'm like, then who the fuck did? Like, who was just recreationally running around these woods setting up like a wire slicing trap at neck height. Who else was it?
That scene always makes me think of You're Next, which is another one of my favorite horror movies.
Yes. Yes.
But yeah, and it kind of goes back to like the way Fee gets kind of kicked out of the who should live category because he doesn't want to be a murderer at like 19. He doesn't want to be a serial killer, you know, which is a seeming betrayal of Non. And I did see some interesting kind of post-series talk about what did Non want and how it ultimately didn't matter because Non is dead. Like, what Non ultimately probably wanted more than anything was to fucking be alive. Like, which I agree with. I think that was, you know, I agree with that. Like, Non ultimately probably just would have rather lived instead of those other characters dying because he wanted a chance to live his life.
Yeah, I think there's also something very deft, too, in this idea that these two characters that are committed to this revenge were not close to Non leading up to his death. They were both absent in those, like, last kind of cascade down into, ultimately, Non's death, and that not only does it not matter what Non would want, but they don't really know. Like, they think of themselves as the ones who would know what Non wanted, but they were not a support for Non. They were not intimately connecting with Non. Probably if they had been, Non would not have ended up where he did.
Mm-hmm.
But they are both operating under pretty extreme assumptions. And I love that because the show doesn't give you a solid answer. Like, we don't know if this is what Non would have wanted to happen. I honestly, given the relationship they presented between Non and Nu, I don't get the impression that Non would at all be into his fucking golden child brother trying to, like, redeem himself after he's dead to be like, oh, I'm actually a good brother. For me, and this is just my opinion, I don't think that's something Non would want, just down a level of he didn't really seem to like his fucking brother at all. So
yeah, that was the thing. He did not seem to like his brother at all, which inherently makes Nu's goals much more selfish. And I think this is where fandom kind of ended up creating expectations that were ultimately going to be let down by, because this isn't a slasher. And if it was, Nu would still die, because if anybody's going to be the final girl, that means that the slasher has to die.
Yes.
And then, like, you know, this isn't a by straight up revenge story either, like The Glory, because there are characters that actually feel remorseful. And Nu is also involving innocent people. Like, in The Glory, she has a chance to involve an innocent child in her revenge plot, but she doesn't. She actively chooses not to. She's not trying to continue the cycle here. But Nu is fucking gung-ho to continue the cycle. Like, he knows what he's gonna do, and he doesn't make some shit up about, like, White, you should stay home because there's leashes out here or some shit. Like, I don't know. Like, you know, some bullshit. Because he knows what he's gonna do. And he does it. He sets the trap. Like, he's the one. I thought it was interesting that fandom was like, well, how would Fee know all of this? And I'm like, but this is a very standard narrative device. Mm-hmm. Like, that a lot of film and TV uses, where another character will kind of like give expository dialogue to explain the things that we've missed, you know? And like fill in the gaps of like the mystery. And since Fee knows that Nu is the one on board with the murder, he's able to fill in those gaps. And we're supposed to just take that at face value. Like, that's just how the narrative works. I was surprised that people were so adamantly like, Nu didn't do that and Fee doesn't really know, because it is such a common thing I see.
Yeah.
It's such a common thing for another character to kind of like info dump on us.
Well, because someone's got to explain it at a certain point. Like,
exactly.
You know.
It would either be Fee or Nu that would explain it, like during his big bad guy speech. But I like that Fee does it because I don't need a big bad guy speech from Nu. And Nu doesn't seem the type of character. And it cuts down time that we can spend on other things. So just structurally, it makes sense. But also, yes, we are supposed to take that as face value. Yes, Nu did kill food delivery uncle, and that man had a family. Like,
he did.
You know, he didn't need to die that way, but he did, and Nu killed him. That was an active choice.
So what I think is really interesting that I saw too is that people very much are assumed that Fee and Nu genuinely had the same plan. And I think it's pretty clear that wasn't the case. I think it's pretty clear that Nu did not tell Fee that he was planning actively to kill these people. So I think it also kind of leads to this weird tension of like, I think Nu is also using Fee.
I would agree with that. It seemed really clear in the narrative that Fee had no fucking clue. again, for me, it's like I can't be mad at Fee for not wanting to become a serial killer just because
No.
revenge for a dude he dated for like a couple months.
And I think too, there's an interesting point there that I saw a couple people making and that we talked about is that at this point, Non has been gone for significantly longer than Fee and Non dated.
Yeah.
I think what got me about it is people were very angry about Fee moving on. And I'm like, but that's actually what should happen. Like, it should happen that Fee doesn't throw his entire life into a boyfriend that went missing. Like, it is good that he started to get over it, that he started to make peace with it, I guess.
That's healthy.
Yeah, that's healthy. That's actually what you want to happen. Fee and Nu are two sides of like the coin of what do you do with grief. On the one hand, you have grieving and then moving on, continuing to live your own life. And on the other hand, you have dropping every other element of your life to center grief in your world such that every action you take is motivated by that core of grief.
Yeah. And I do want to like acknowledge that Nu got a raw deal. Like both his parents are dead, his brother is dead, or at least his brother is gone, and he doesn't at that point know what happened to his brother. So I understand why he turns to like this slow obsession. Though I do think an adult infiltrating a high school, it was done and never been kissed, and it was weird then, and it's weird now. Like
Yeah, I do think that's weird.
I feel like you could have just given like Fee information and maybe coached him like instead of infiltrating the high school yourself.
There's a very like I don't know, like wanting to feel the blood on his face quality to Nu, where he doesn't just want it to happen, he wants to be there. He wants to do it. He wants to see the look in like your eye when he enacts his revenge. For me, that's what made him so unsettling in like the last couple episodes, where it was like, oh, this dude is having fun doing this.
Which makes him a more interesting character. Like, for me, I feel like people are going to listen to this and think that, like, we don't like Nu. But I actually do like Nu as a character. I like almost all the characters because they all function. And when I talk about, quote unquote, liking a character, I don't mean that I think that they're good people.
Oh,
that
God, no.
I think, you know, they, like, I'm going to stand them or something like that. And no, what I mean is I appreciate their function within a narrative. Like, you know that I cannot stand that man, that cop from freaking demonic cultivation, Grandmaster of cultivation. Like,
yes, I know.
And I don't like him. He a hypocrite. But.
And he was mean to your favorite.
He was mean to my little man in his little hat. My sweet little Mau Mau. But. His function in the narrative is great. And, like, I like his function in the narrative. Like, the story does actually not... It doesn't work without him. It does not work without this character. So, like, I can dislike the character in and of itself, but, like, still appreciate their place in the narrative. And it's the same thing with, like, do I like Poor? No. But I like what he does in the narrative. I appreciate his function within the narrative. So, like, all the Dead Friend Forever characters, like, I can't fucking stand Fluke because he's the type of hypocrite I don't like.
Yes.
He's the type of bystander that I don't like, and, like, as a character.
Honestly, he's kind of very, like, the cop's brother in the sense of, like, I don't know what to do. I didn't do it. I can't.
Yes.
Like, I don't know what to do. Like, it's very funny, like, now that I'm thinking about it. Like...
That's so real.
Yeah. And, like, I was very gratified when Top and Fluke threw each other over the balcony and killed each other. Like, that was great. That was fantastic.
I was like, damn, y'all made of glass bones. I've fallen downstairs before. I didn't
like,
break a
one
neck.
story. I mean, admittedly, Top had been shot in the stomach, so he probably had other things happen.
But yeah, so I appreciate, like, Nu's function in the story a lot. You know, it's just that I think I view Nu in a very different light than most of fandom because, like, I don't think his motivations are altruistic at all.
No.
And I don't think he's 100% justified. I'm sorry. I understand that some people were like, oh, well, y'all bitches can't hold grudges and stuff. But I don't want to hold grudges against a bunch of teenagers.
Yeah, and I think what kind of gets me about that argument is that I think that often, it's kind of going back to slasher movies, when you're looking at the victims in slasher movies, their death is always the worst possible option for them because most of the time they specifically haven't done anything. They're just innocently going about their lives, so being murdered by a surprise slasher is a shitty thing. But in more psychological stories, and even in this one, I think there's an argument to be made that real suffering for some of them at least, would have been living. That the worst thing New could have done, like in terms of if he really wanted to just make them suffer, would have been to let them walk out of that cabin, now burdened with the knowledge of like what they're capable of doing when they're pushed against a wall, burdened knowing that their life could be destroyed at any second if someone decided to tell the truth.
Yeah, and that was the ending I wanted. To go back to Girl from Nowhere, that's how that two-parter of season 1 finale ends. Like,
Yes.
it tricks you into thinking everybody's dead, and then in reality, none of them are. None of the characters are dead.
Nope.
But they are all fundamentally changed by the experience, and they can no longer commit to ignorance, you know, because they know not only their secrets are out in the open, but the secrets of these people that they had supposedly trusted and even cared for are out in the open, and they can't look at each other or themselves the same again. And I find that so much more, one, in line with horror as a genre, and two, vastly more fascinating than an everybody dies type of ending, which, like, look, again, I'm a huge slasher fan. But, like, the thing about slashers, too, is that the deaths tend to be so freaking cartoony that, like, it's no longer within the bounds of reality. Like, no one's killing bitches with a bread cutter.
No. So great, though. In some ways, kind of, there's another really great kind of commentary on horror movie called Cabin in the Woods. And one of the things that's kind of a main plot point of that movie is, one, it has a fantastic twist. It has one of like the best like gotcha twists in any movie. But the whole thing in that movie is centered around these character archetypes. And in slashers, that's what you get. You get the final girl. You get the clown. You get the jock. You get the... I think they just call it the whore specifically.
Yeah.
And in slasher movies, that's because these characters are often so interchangeable. They're not really that distinct from each other. Like, we know what the final girl is like. We know that, like, her technically prettier and more popular friend who probably has sex is gonna fit into that, you know, horror box. We know that there's gonna be like a funny jokey guy who maybe is like a little high, maybe is like a little drunk, like a jester role. So you don't have to like remember their names, and their characters are usually very slapped on, right? If you look at Cabin in the Woods, you don't really learn anything about the backstories of any of these characters, and it works because they are actually archetypes. What's different in Dead Friends Forever is that you can't do the same thing in Dead Friends Forever, because these are all people with specific things that they have done, specific guilts, specific lack of guilt. And I think that makes it so much more lingering of a story.
I agree.
Than a kind of standard slasher.
And, like, there have been attempts at making a slasher television show. There's been, like, 3 attempts with fucking Scream. And they're all bad. And the issue that you see a lot of those attempts make is that with a slasher, one, audience expectation is going in, you know bodies are going to hit the floor, to quote a song. I don't know if that's too old for the youths either, but, you know, listen to it anyway. If you watch Dawn of the Dead, the Zack Snyder one specifically, though I recommend both.
That's kind of the premise of that movie, Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. Is bodies hitting the floor.
So many bodies. But yeah, like when you go into a slasher, like if you're going into Thanksgiving, you are not going in there expecting a reason, quote unquote, for any of these characters to die, because typically there is not a reason. Like usually in the first act of a slasher, a lot of random people who aren't even named die, because one, you got to feed that kind of bloodlust of the audience, you know, and also to build stakes, like this person means business, you know. Like when I watch Prom Night, both the original and the new one, and they're both not that great. The original is better, and the new one is absolutely boring. You have essentially like the red shirts, you know, the people in the hotel at the prom that are, you don't know those people. Those people don't matter. They are literally just bodies to add to the count, because you have to keep the pace up. Because that's the other thing about slashers, is that your pace has to be always moving, and you can't really do that in a TV show.
No,
not to the extent where it has to be quick, because it has to continuously build, you know, until all the characters are whittled down to like the final 3.
Right, because like in slashers, and this can be a little bit different for like the final girl and like the second to last person, they usually will get a little bit more of a backstory, a little bit more depth. But everybody who dies leading up to that point, their function is not to be a victim that you sympathize with. Their function is to make the slasher cooler or more interesting or more brutal. And then you see the flip side in something like Dead Friends Forever, where, again, these are not interchangeable characters. And you'd see something in, like, Midsommar. Like, those are not interchangeable characters. Like, anything Ari Aster has made, not
Mm-hmm.
interchangeable. A lot of, I think, kind of, like, in Get Out, like, not interchangeable. Anything Jordan Peele has done, not
Yeah.
interchangeable. And to my mind, if I'm looking at horror, slashers are actually meant to be fun. Like, they're not, I don't think they're usually meant to be that scary. They are meant to make you jump. They might be meant to be gross, but I think they are exciting. Like, they are intended to be exciting and fun more than they're intended to truly fill you with fear. Versus psychological horror movies, where their intent is for it to linger with you, for you to be thinking about what does it say about the woman in Midsommar? Where does, like, cult indoctrination begin and her own choices end? Did she really choose her ending, or was she also a victim? You know, something like that. I think a lot of people in fandom were approaching it assuming that they were going to get a fun ending, and instead they got the lingering ending, the ending that doesn't necessarily answer a question.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's where fandom expectations were, I don't want to say out of line because that sounds mean. Like, and I'm not trying to be mean. But I do think that like fandom expectations were kind of over here on the left and the bus was driving towards the east.
I think a lot of people expected a BL ending and they got a horror ending.
And like an actual horror ending, like
Yeah.
not a slasher ending, which the end of the classics, as we were saying earlier with Catharsis, Nightmare on Elm ends with Nancy still in the dream.
It's the exact same ending, actually, but
Yeah.
it has a very different cast. A
Yes.
very different, like, tenor.
It is the exact same ending because it sets you up for catharsis, right? Like it sets you up. She's defeated Freddy, and she woke up and she's fine and like everything's bright. The birds are chirping outside. Her mother is waving to her, and then she gets in that car and Freddy is alive and he like drags
She never
her mother.
woke up.
Yeah, she never woke up. And like that, when I saw that ending, it was like a punch to the throat, and I loved every second of it.
Yes.
But like a lot of the OG slashers, because they were meant to be scary, have those types of endings. A lot of more modern day slashers don't. They do have a more like by the numbers, cathartic, happy ending. Oh, the slasher is either dead or like Jensen Ackles walks off with like the miner's mask or whatever, and you're like, oh my god, what's gonna happen next? And it's like nothing.
It's a
This is
sequel.
never getting a sequel. 'Cause this is My Bloody Valentine in 3D. Like
In 3D, I forgot about that part.
that whole era of 3D horror movies, like James Cameron owes me money.
3D gives me such bad migraines. So, like, for a while in there, I was watching, like, much flatter horror movies than everybody else because I could not do the fucking 3D.
I watched Final Destination, I think it was 5, the one with the bridge, in 3D.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, if you watch it without the glasses, it's just bad CGI. But I was also like, I don't really need to see the guts coming at me. Now I just feel sticky.
To briefly detour into Final Destination, I feel like with like the more recent Final Destinations, they've gone for like gore, and sometimes they succeed with like the Rube Goldbergness of the deaths. Like I think that one also has the suntan bed one that is
That
a
was
little
3.
bit funny. 3, okay. But like realistically, the most visceral thing Final Destination has ever done is the logs on the truck.
The fucking logs.
Because even now, if I'm going behind a truck that has logs on it, I am getting in a different lane.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
trying to pass it. Like I'm not
Immediately.
risking that shit. Like no, thank you.
Without a doubt, to kind of tie it to expectations, like the first 2 Final Destinations, everybody died in these ways that seemed grounded or like at least somewhat potentially realistic. Like,
Yes.
like Final Destination 2 started pushing it, but the car pileup feels very realistic, which is why everybody and their mother's cousin's uncle's baby daddy are scared of trucks with logs now. Or the first one with like the plane blowing up. Like that's a real fear people have. I know because I have a lot of family members that don't like flying. Ironic because the islands is where we're from. But Final Destination is an interesting franchise because it gets more and more away from like that kind of grounded, rooted fear.
Which doesn't necessarily make them less fun. I think in some ways they get a little bit more fun as the deaths get more
absolutely.
elaborate and ridiculous.
Oh, so ridiculous. The tanning bed one is wild. I do remember that one.
Oh, the acupuncture one I think is the one that's in the bridge one.
Oh gosh, yeah, that one. Ugh. And yeah, but as they get more elaborate, like I remember there was one where like an escalator broke and like ate a chick or something like that, and I was like, that's not.
No, there's the gymnast one too that I also like gets me again because it feels more realistic. Like it,
Mm-hmm.
it is more realistic that a gymnast could fall really wrong and break their back. Like that's a real thing that has happened.
To compare it to like slashers and stuff, like as slashers have evolved, because again they're decade old subgenre, or decades old I should say, they get less and less to like their roots, you know, which is why you see a lot of slasher comedies like Freaky and Totally Killer, etc., because it's a very easy genre to meta and to make a comedy because it's no longer scary, you know, quote unquote, because it's no longer super realistic and it's not going off of realistic fears. Whereas like with a Midsommar or with a Ring, you know, and with a Dead Friend Forever, the root cause of the fear and anxieties are real things. They are grounded in
Yeah.
something real. And that's why there's no easy endings.
Exactly. What I think too with slashers, one of the things the slasher genre deals with that other horror doesn't is that you are almost guaranteed to not be able to make a character that lands in the way that any of the classics do. Because the genre is now so familiar that it is almost impossible to make an archetypal villain that will stand out, that
Mm-hmm.
people will latch onto. The better way, I think, a lot of the time, accurately, is to twist the way you're approaching the genre, like Happy Death Day, because you're not going to make a guy, you're very unlikely to create a guy that will hit in the same way that Freddy or Jason or Michael Myers do.
Yeah, no, exactly. And you'll see with like a lot of the newer slashers that veer more towards comedy, they are much more focused on making a more interesting quote unquote final girl because that's a
Yes.
character that can stand out, you know, or they go the opposite direction and they just make wild kills.
Because that's Final Destination. It's the wildness of the kills. It's the Rube Goldberg machine of them.
Exactly. It's skinning someone and baking their skin into Christmas cookies in Black Christmas. Like,
Yeah.
you know, in one of the Black Christmases. Because again, there's been like fucking 4 of them. That's why like Dead Friend Forever, it fundamentally isn't a slasher. But I feel like that expectation really rubbed up against what the show was actually doing. Because as we said before, like the show is very gray in a lot of ways. Like some things obviously are very, you know, non-being bullied is wrong. Obviously.
Yes, of
You know,
course.
the gangster uncle, he's a bad guy, obviously. But like, what are the answers to fixing these fundamental problems? The show doesn't answer those. And how responsible are these characters and how deserving are they of their deaths and how justified is New's revenge plan? Those are answers that the show does not provide. And I think fandom at large was kind of hoping for those answers because they were hoping for catharsis, which I just fundamentally as a horror anything, but like especially as like psychological horror, the show was just never going to offer that catharsis, which I didn't want.
I didn't either. One of the questions that I felt the show was kind of pushing towards, to step back for a second, I would argue that the ending of the show is very much telegraphed by the back half of it. I do not think the ending is like some kind of final flip into a different genre. If you've watched horror and you're kind of familiar with the way horror movies go, once you got into what was happening to Non being cumulative and impacted much more than just by like the girl from nowhere in that last episode, they all beat her to death with sticks. So very easy black and white. That was the big incident that ruined it. To me, as that got more complicated, it was very obvious to me that the ending was probably going to leave things really unsettled. I would also argue that I think one of the questions the show kind of suggests is whether or not New has the right to be taking this revenge on these people in the first place. He did not have a relationship with his brother. And I think that's an important part of his like grief is that he doesn't know his brother. He never did. He knows in some ways the least about Non. So does he really have the right to be doing this?
Yeah, and I know people bring up the fact that Non had gone to the house and like got the knife out, was ready to like stab and 8 people and stuff. But the fact that he doesn't, like, I don't even think he cuts any of them. Like, or maybe he cuts top, I can't remember. He isn't able to kill any of them. We don't know how Non would have reacted if he had. Would he feel triumphant? I feel like some fans would want him to feel triumphant because they feel like it would be justified. But is that true to the character in and of himself? Like, we just don't know, you know? Like,
Right.
I don't know if he would feel triumphant or if he would feel guilty afterwards.
Yeah. What I think the thing too with Non for me is it's like this is very clearly he is taking these actions because he's having a fucking breakdown. These are not choices that he's making with a clear mind, having sat down and thought about the options and the consequences and decided, you know what, it's worth it. I'm gonna go get my revenge.
Mm-hmm.
This is Non who has been arrested, who owes money to the mafia, who has been pretty brutally dumped by his boyfriend, who has had a very intense thing happen with the tutor. This is not someone who is. This choice is being made under such duress and such stress that I think it's wrong to treat it as.
Almost like a clear-headed decision.
I think it's almost wrong to treat it as a decision rather than a reaction.
Now, I can agree with that. Like, even the way he was reacting, it felt like desperation. And in this very kind of sad, tragic sense that he was pushed so far that he would be this desperate. So yeah, it's to me it's like the show leaves that open-ended if Non really would have killed them. And if he would have felt better had he. Like, we won't.
Yeah.
The audience won't know. And more importantly, like within the narrative, New will never know, you know?
Yeah.
And that's one of those gray areas that I find very fascinating about the show and why I like the ending. So, like, we've been talking about the ending, and, like, the way it ends is in this kind of, like, open-ended way. Like, you don't really know if the final three characters that are on screen alive, which are T, Fee, and Jin, who I also find very interesting is that, like, the three characters that survive, quote-unquote, are also the three characters that felt the most remorse for what happened.
Yeah. Remember when we were waiting for, like, the last episode to air, we were kind of talking about our predictions, and one of the things we agreed with was that we were pretty positive that Fee, Jin, and T were going to survive.
Yeah. There was nothing about the ending that, like, surprised me.
White was the only thing that surprised me.
Yes. There was that, yeah.
And not like, it wasn't super shocking. It was more like, oh, that's interesting. They went there.
Yeah, that was the thing. I didn't expect them to go there because of the whole, like, you know, White and T relationship. But, you know, when you think about it and when I thought about it afterwards, I was like, oh, yeah, no, it makes actually a lot of sense for White to die because of what he symbolically means within the narrative and such.
Yeah. I mean, I wanted White to live because that poor twink did not want to be on that vacation.
Did not want to even be there. He was not supposed to be there today. But yeah, like, there was nothing super surprising about the ending, which was fine. But I did want it to end in that kind of open-ended way. My one issue, or I guess my main issue with the ending, is that they explained the twist, which I didn't like. I don't need expository dialogue.
I agree. What I would have left in, if I were in charge of the world, would have been the, like, do you remember how we got out of the cabin? I think you could have left that line in, and that would have been enough.
Yeah, for me, it's like, I think the show could have cut to black. Fee sees Non, he looks back at Jin, he's still seeing Non in the background, Non's looking at the camera, and then we see, like, quick flashes of the house, and then that's it, and then it just cuts to black. Like, we never really know if they're still at the house, or, you know, if, like, we do know that they're haunted by Non's specter, almost, you know, either literally or emotionally, for the foreseeable future. To me, that would have just worked better. That's essentially what happens, but it still would have worked better without the expository dialogue of, like, hey, there's a twist.
So this is absolutely, like, 2.5 hours late to make this point. But one of the things I think you and I had talked about once you'd kind of binge the whole thing was that in many ways, the early parts of the show are much closer to a haunted house movie than to a slasher.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very deep cut of Stephen King lore, but, like, Rose Red, which is a miniseries from the 90s.
Wow, what a throwback.
I really like it. Like, it's I don't know. I think it's fun. But that's one of the things we talked about where, like, there's such a sense of haunting throughout the entire show in a way. I know we've talked a lot about why it's not slasher, but, like, in a way that didn't kind of resonate in the way slashers would, where, like, the secret, the, like, base in the room where someone is not there was such a, like, present theme in a way that, like I said, reminded me a little bit of haunted house stories.
I think that's actually really interesting, and, like, I completely agree too, because I feel like that's more in line with, like, a lot of the Asian horror that I've watched. I will say, like, horror from Japan and Korea and Thailand, and I'm not as familiar with Thai horror. It's still, like, an avenue I'm exploring. But, like, and I haven't watched all of it, and all of it is very vast, like, and differential and such. Yeah. But in a lot of the like the Ring film, that is a ghost story essentially that's extremely fucking unnerving. And its ending ends in a similar way where you think the characters have broken the curse, and then there's that moment of catharsis. Okay, the sun is shining again, and then you find out that the curse is not broken,
and that they're going to perpetuate the curse.
Yeah, they're going to continue the curse on. And it's for their own survival. Like that's the only way they can keep surviving. And
Yeah.
it's such a gut punch of an ending, and it lingers with you. And that's the type of horror that I see a lot. When I watch a lot of like Japanese, like same with like when I read like Japanese horror manga, which I don't do a ton because it's for some reason reading horror kind of gets me more than watching it.
Well, like you mentioned Junji Ito, which like the thing about him is he's not just a writer, he's a manga artist. And like the one I think that goes around the internet the most is, I don't remember what it's called, but it's the one where the holes start showing up in the side of the mountain, the exact shape of people.
Oh yeah.
What's interesting about that one, it's just to kind of detour into him for a second, is if you try to explain with words why it's horrifying, it sounds really stupid. Like, it does not sound scary at all, but it's one of the scariest things that I've ever read.
It truly is, because you need those visuals. By the way, he also has a whole book about his cats, and his artwork is extremely visceral, which is why his horror stories work so well.
Because it's always about things, like I said, that aren't scary. It's about like a hole in a mountain, about a spiral. Like, how does it make a fucking spiral scary? Fucking read the one that's about the spiral.
Yeah, Uzumaki. Oh gosh.
Oh god.
Which actually, someone pointed out that one of the characters in Dead Friend Forever was reading Uzumaki.
Yeah.
Again, it kind of goes because neither of those stories end in any sort of catharsis.
Exactly. You know what Dead Friends Forever reminds me of? Kind of going back to the haunted house thing for a little bit. It reminds me of The Outsiders, which I think it's what it's called, the Nicole Kidman one, where you kind of
The
ultimately
Others.
The Others, sorry,
Yes.
The Others. It reminds me very much of The Others, where there is something wrong with a place that is more about the people that are in it.
Yeah, I think that's ultimately when it comes to like the show, its horror subgenres, fandom, I think slashers are just the most mainstream and familiar in terms of like all the horror genres. And it's not even just that, like that's one factor. And then another factor is, like you said, it does kind of start off with the aesthetics of slashers, and it does have like the masked killer and such, but it does not remain a slasher. But I think some folks had like trouble kind of adjusting their expectations a little bit. And if slashers are the only type of horror you really know, because you're not an annoying nerd like me, then it would be hard to kind of like adjust your expectations to like the ending that we got and White dying, which I think is why a lot of people were always pushing these theories of like White's on non side or White's on new side or White is non. Because they wanted him to live and they needed like a reason for him to live. But the fact that he dies makes a lot of sense in the narrative, and in an awful way, like it does make the ending stronger.
It does. And I think too, I saw people ascribing stuff they didn't like to weak writing and not a deliberate element of the story that makes it resonate more. Because, like we talked about, White is the everyman. So White was always a problem for New. If New really expected to kill everyone who hurt his brother, White was a problem. And since we so early saw that New would kill someone innocent to reach his further goals, like it tracks that White is acceptable collateral damage.
There's no ending where White and New would both live, because White is a witness who is also uninvolved in the carnage. Like, he is completely innocent in regarding all of this. New killed the person he loved.
Right. And even if he had lived, I'm like, in what fucking world is this tiny little twink who's so in love with his boyfriend that his biggest fear in his life is the boyfriend no longer wanting him? What part of him's gonna be like, you know what, having been through these days of trauma and now that I'm covered in blood and my boyfriend is dead, I think you were right and we should be besties? Like, no.
It's not realistic. .gif. Like,
yeah.
It's not realistic. Like, that was never gonna happen. And it was just one of those things where it's like what the fandom wanted was just not what the show was building towards, unfortunately. And that's not bad writing.
I think in some ways they're feeling what the writing kind of wanted you to feel. They're feeling that, like, this isn't fair. These people should have lived. Like, and it's funny that in some ways I'm like, yeah, you're feeling what the writing was intended to make you feel, but you think it's bad writing because you don't like the feeling. And I'm like, that's horror, baby.
That is horror in a nutshell. Like, you think I didn't want Haruyuki to survive the ring? Of course I did. I love him, but like, it is what absolutely. It is.
Like, I can't remember, I can't remember his real name, but he played Chidi in The Good Place. Did I want him to survive Midsommar? Yes, because in the extended version of the movie, he has the best insult I've ever heard, which is when he yells at a fellow grad student, when I met you, you didn't even know how to use JSTOR. Like, he should have lived based on the strength of that academic burn alone. So, yeah, I didn't like seeing him die. I didn't want him to die. And that was the feeling I was supposed to feel.
Yeah, like, good horror is supposed to, like, challenge you. It's supposed to make you unsettled. It's supposed to entertain you. Like, obviously, like, look, Cocaine Bear technically counts as horror just because people are dying. But it's not scary at all. It's more of a B movie. But, like, I love that movie. That movie is so entertaining.
I love that movie, too.
It's so great.
Funny.
It's so funny.
With the paramedics is so funny to me.
I could rewatch that scene over and over again. But, like, you're not supposed to feel attached to any of the characters that, like, the movie clearly sets you up to feel attached to. Like, there are specific markers that showcase, especially in things that are horror-based. Like, monster movies are kind of adjacent. They were originally horror films, and they're kind of become, like, their own genre now. But, like, those types of films and TV shows will set up certain markers for, like, characters you were supposed to, like, not want to die, so that when they do die, you feel it more. And White is one of those characters. You don't want White to die, but he kind of needs to, like, to emphasize how far New has gone and how unjustified New has been in continuing this cycle of violence. Yeah, so it's like, did I like it? Like, no, I felt really sad for him. Like, I was upset, but I was meant to be, and that's good writing.
Yeah. Well, and I think, too, one of the things about, like, markers for characters that are meant to die is that if you've watched, like, an amount of horror, especially, like, talking to you about horror, you and I both kind of understand the idea of, that guy looks like a victim. Like, within a horror movie, like, Fluke looks like a victim. Like, we were both pretty sure that Fluke was gonna die.
Oh, yeah.
In the final episode, because he looks like a victim. And in some ways, it's kind of hard to explain necessarily, but I think it's the red shirt thing that you mentioned earlier in Star Trek, where it's like there's a particular, like, visual and narrative language around certain characters that says, this person's gonna die. It's like, if someone has to die, it's gonna be that guy.
They are marked for death. Like, is what it comes down to. I feel like, even though I think that Dead Friend Forever is, like, a good baby's first horror, like, it's a good entryway into horror and stuff, and I would recommend, you know, unless, like, you genuinely can't deal with, like, graphic gore, which not all horror movies are graphically gory. Personally, I'm not a fan of the later Saw films. I do not like Hostel. I do not like the later entries into Wrong Turn. I don't like anything by Eli Roth, but that has to deal with, like, racism. But, like, you know, there's so many avenues of horror, and I feel like Dead Friend Forever kind of dabbles in quite a few of them, and I think it's such a great entry point for folks that might be more interested in exploring other horror. Like, the first season of Girl From Nowhere is not graphically gory. Like, there's other graphic things. I would definitely look up the Does the Dog Die page for this show. It earns every one of them, but it's not, like, graphically gory, you know?
No, I don't think so.
The Ring isn't graphically gory or anything. It's just highly unsettling.
Yeah. So I think as we're wrapping up, if you like Dead Friends Forever and now you want to watch more horror stuff, I would recommend, none of these are going to be BLs. Like, horror BLs are, I don't know of any other than this one, but I would recommend, like we mentioned, Fear Street. If you like the kind of teenagerness of it, the, like, high school, like, hormones kind of thing, Fear Street's really good. If you like the kind of unsettling sadness, anything by, I can't remember his name, but he did like The Haunting of Hill House for Netflix, The Fall of the House of Usher. Those ones are not really gory at all.
Mike Flanagan.
Mike Flanagan, thank you. Those could be good choices if you're into the real horrors, the grief and the inevitability and the sadness. Those can be really solid choices as well. I don't know, in terms of slasher, I'm trying to think. I would say A Nightmare on Elm Street is the most approachable of the classic slashers. It's my favorite of them. So if you're gonna get into slashers, that's kind of where I would recommend starting. If you're not into the specific slashers, I think I mentioned a couple times, like I really liked Happy Death Day as kind of a horror comedy. That was a lot of fun. There's some seasons of American Horror Story that I would recommend. Not all of them. My personal favorite is I think it's called Freak Show. So, I think that one's solid. Asylum is also solid as well. Oh, and Cabin in the Woods. Cabin in the Woods I've actually had a lot of success with being multiple friends' first horror movie that they actually liked. So, Cabin in the Woods, it is gory, but it's extremely funny in its gore. Not to spoil, but there's an ending free-for-all that is one of the funniest things that's ever been in a horror movie.
It's so
There's
wild.
a whole merman joke that, like, made me almost cry laughing in the theater. As an aside, Cabin in the Woods has an extremely attractive cast.
One of Chris Hemsworth's earliest roles.
It does have the greater Hemsworth in it. And Bradley Whitford is there, who was also in Get Out.
Oh gosh, let me shonen protagonist crack my neck here as I go down my horror list.
I was about to say, you are much more versed in Asian horror than I am, so.
Okay, so like, I think if you're a film fan and you want to watch some classics, I would always recommend the originals of all like the main slasher guys. So like the first Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the first Friday, the first Nightmare on Elm, and the first Halloween. I think out of all four of those, Halloween and Nightmare are the ones that aged the best in terms of just overall quality.
Yes.
Not gonna lie to you, the first Friday is pretty boring, actually. I do still love that score, that like that snaps is still snapping.
It's so good.
But the twist is stupid, and the movie's kind of boring. But there's a Kevin Bacon in it.
Yeah, exactly. And also, I can't emphasize enough how much weirder the first Texas Chainsaw Massacre is than I think I was expecting it to be.
It's
It
so
is
strange.
so much weirder than I thought.
It's so strange. So yeah, so if you want to see kind of like the roots of slasher and you kind of just want to explore the film origins, those are four good ones to kind of go through. Of their franchises, all the Texas Chainsaw Massacres in the franchise, of which, yes, I have unfortunately seen, none of them are really good.
No.
Of Halloween, the first Halloween, not H2O, but the first one where Jamie Lee Curtis comes back. That one is good. The other two are not. I would just watch that first one of the new trilogy. Of the Fridays, I'm not going to lie, Jason Takes Manhattan is a banger. I fucking love that stupid movie. If you want a slasher franchise that's just kind of dumb fun, I would definitely go with the Friday films. Skip 2. He doesn't even have his hockey mask yet. That's the first one where Jason actually shows up. But he doesn't have his hockey mask or his machete. Don't worry about it. But there's one where Jason has to fight like a psychic. Hilarious. There's one where Jason comes back via lightning. Actually, that's two different movies. He comes back via lightning. Also hilarious. There's one where he goes to Manhattan and he's killing people in Manhattan. Jason X, where he is in space. Again, not a porno. If it leads to one of those films, that's not my fault. Maybe put Friday the 13th. Jason X, I don't know. Jason versus Freddy, or Freddy versus Jason, is a crossover film with Freddy from Nightmare on Elm Street and Jason Voorhees from Friday. Does it make sense? No. It is also amazingly hilarious. Kelly Ringwald is in that film.
It's absolutely necessary. Oh, if you want something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Rob Zombie has movies that are also about a weird incesty murder family that I think are more fun and more interesting, with like the sketchy ass clown guy who's kind of like aware of this murder family. I don't know that I would say that they're good exactly, but they're more fun if for some reason you're really craving a very unsettling family situation with murder.
For horror comedy, I really liked Freaky. It has Vince Vaughn in it. It's very fun. It also has the actress from the recent film Lisa Frankenstein. That one was fun. The Final Girls has one of the actresses from American Horror Story as the lead. That's also very fun. Happy Death Day. Absolutely recommend that.
I would also recommend Happy Death Day 2, which is honestly a very solid sequel and did something I did not expect with it.
I have actually not seen the sequel, so now I kind of want to see the sequel.
It's so fun.
And then a recent film, Totally Killer, is also very, very fun. I really liked Totally Killer as well. None of those are scary, they're all horror comedy. If you want to do other film things like for horror, zombies are also kind of their own genre now. And a lot of them
Yeah.
are scary films. I will always recommend the OG Night of the Living Dead by George Romero. I feel like it still holds up, even if it's not super, super scary. But the ending is also a fucking gut punch, and one of my favorite horror endings of all time, Train to Busan.
Train to Busan was what I was going to say next. And 28 Days Later is also better.
Those are also they also fall within like the zombie-esque genre, but both are really, really good.
And Train to Busan has my favorite man, who's the husband of the pregnant lady.
Oh,
What
Don
is his
Lee.
name? Dong Lee. The beautiful, wonderful Dong Lee, who is a goddamn delight.
Oh my god, he is so delightful. I went on a whole film kick with him because Amazon has a bunch of his movies. We don't have time for that tangent because I will be here a while. But Train to Busan is also a phenomenal. It's in my top 3 for zombie films overall. Hashtag Alive, another Korean zombie horror film, is also amazing. What else? Perfect Blue is an animated film by Satoshi Ko. Literally
It's devastating.
oh my god, one of the best psychological horror films you will ever watch, in my opinion. A Tale of Two Sisters, I believe is Korean and not Japanese. I don't remember off the top of my head. They did an American remake with Emily Browning. I think it was called The Unknown, maybe The Unboard. I don't remember. But the remake's But the original is awesome. The Forgotten is a Korean horror film that had one of the wildest plot twists that I've ever seen. And it plays a lot with genre, like what type of horror it is. So that was a lot of fun. Anything by Junjo Ito, like his work, is really good. I like the mountain one personally, and all these will be linked down below as well. Uzumaki, obviously, but he has a whole catalog. Like he has a whole thing that folks can kind of look into.
I would also say it's very likely if you see the images in it, some of them will be familiar to you because many of them float around the internet as like, this is scary. They're worse in context.
They are worse in context. He plays a lot with body horror, so that's something to kind of be aware of. Netflix has quite a few Thai horror movies. I've only been able to watch The Whole Truth, which I liked aspects of. I didn't love it, but it is out there and it is more accessibly available. And it's not terrible, but I feel like a lot of the stuff that I saw in The Whole Truth is also kind of reminiscent of the stuff you see in Dead Friend Forever, as far as like structural issues, things that are directly affecting teenagers, this kind of like past issues or like these past acts of violence coming back to haunt the characters in that sense. Oh, a classic for anime, Vampire Princess Mayu. I don't know if you can even find it anymore. I rented it also at a Blockbuster when I was a kid, and it is gothic vampire anime romance horror. It was everything. Like some of the stories, it's anthology-esque, so some of the stories were wild, and some of them just like, the mermaid one really upset me, but that's another one. Oh, You're Next, and Ready or Not.
Yes. Ready or Not is a lot of fun.
Oh, Ready or Not is a blast.
The ending of that movie,
dude,
it's perfect.
Chef's fucking kiss. It's so great.
It's so good.
Obviously, the original Scream.
Yes, of course.
I'm gonna leave it there.
The Scream franchise, for my money, stays fun for several movies. So yeah, I mean, at a certain point, that's kind of eventually we're just saying here are horror movies that I like. Like, and in terms of BL, there's not really any I can think of. Any BL recommendations if you liked Dead Friends Forever would just be to check out other stuff that Salmon has done. Manner of Death, Triage, 4 Minutes is upcoming with Bible and the new guy. What's his name? Jez. And that's kind of it for BLs. There's not a lot of horror in BL. And I hope that like the success of Dead Friends Forever maybe changes that, because this was a really enjoyable show. It was really fun and really well done. And like I said, way back at the beginning, I really like what Beyond Cloud is doing in terms of the stories they're choosing and kind of expanding what a BL is away from kind of the typical college, university, workplace kind of settings. So hopefully other companies will take notice and start giving a little bit more scary shit. Oh, the only one I can think of is actually Ghost House, which I would say is actually not scary, but it is horror adjacent. There are ghosts and hauntings, and that's also fun. It didn't super stand out to me, but I enjoyed it enough to finish it.
I have not watched that because I'm bad. I'm a bad person. I'm a lazy person. But piggybacking off of that, there's also After Sundown, which was a Z and Ninu vehicle. That was actually a film. I have not watched that either.
Oh, I forgot about that one.
Yeah, it's been on the list. So I can't say if it's good or not, but I do know that it is horror romance.
Oh, what's the one that Fluke was in?
Chippy, which Fluke?
The little one.
Shadow.
Shadow. Yeah, sorry. I lied. I can think of horror BLs. The Shadow is not really a BL. Actually, the Shadow just has a gay character in it. But the Shadow is I think last year from 2023. That is also about a missing kid who is haunting a boarding school. And a lot about, like, the past and how you can't escape it. I had mixed feelings about the ending of it, but I enjoyed it a lot. And Fluke was the only actor I was familiar with, and it was nice to see him get to act against people who could move their faces. So yeah, I would also recommend The Shadow.
So that's our thoughts, which were many, on Dead Friend Forever. Definitely do recommend this series to folks. At least in my opinion, I overall really liked it. I think it was definitely a win for BOC, and yeah, we had a good time, obviously, talking about horror today.
It can be streamed on...
I have dyslexia, so I can't say all the acronym.
I can't remember what's the most, like, ADD thing. It's a green logo where you can also stream Kin Porsche. It's a little I and a big Q. It's something like IQE. I apologize. I am a very visual person.
It's cool. It will actually be linked in, like, the post description.
It will
be. So where you can watch. And yeah, we hope that everybody had a good time listening to all our horror opinions, of which, again, we apparently had many.
I really like doing this kind of show deep dive. I know kind of coming up, we've talked about doing one for Playboy, which I might anticipate could possibly be a two-parter because we both have a lot to say about Playboy.
There could be one about the actual filmmaking and then one about the fandom.
Oh, hell yeah.
So that could be interesting.
And if there's any particular BL that you think would be fun to have us talk about it overall, let us know.
All right, dope. We will see you guys next time.
All right, bye.